Um, the research that I've read, this isn't research that I personally do. It's more on the sort of reader response and how reading, whether it's statistics or reading a story, right? It Initial readers, these sort of reader response studies have shown that if you are reading something that has environmental themes, it tends to make you more than, and you take, sort of like a quiz or something that's dealing with environmental issues, and you're ranking that, you would rank higher in terms of, trying to do more environmental things after reading these kinds of books or stories. And I think that's been shown in for some other subject matters. Broadly speaking, this is that the connection between reading long form narrative as a means of developing empathy. And so, that's, but at the same time, I think it's just like, video games don't make people violent. That, like narrative, is both a reflection of the culture and it can shape that culture. But it's not, like some sort of all powerful thing that's, I think is a sort of brainwashing element either. I don't, I don't have the background or the knowledge about, the sort of publishing or the side of things to be able to say. I mean, beyond that, as probably you all know, and our audience all knows, that the publishing industry has significantly shrunk, at least in terms of, like the various sort of big mainstream houses. Whereas at the same time, that independent means of publishing, we could say, has now become sort of unlimited and exploded, right? That it's pretty inexpensive to self-publish through Amazon and everything. So, that it's, the power of narrative is that it can both create chaos, right? That's the deconstructive element, but also perhaps be a tool of control. And that is why so many different venues, politics especially, is interested and invested in controlling a narrative. I don't know if that exactly addresses your question. I think that there's
before we address the question, I just want everybody to know something's gone nuts. This stream dropped out, and while you were talking, I had a new link for the stream. YouTube just created a new link. I don't know how it did it, but that's the link that I just posted to everybody. Whoever didn't retweet, please retweet this link and get the people back in here. This is just one of those unfortunate things that ends up happening. But
Or is it? I don't see it.
It's two.
yes, this is a second YouTube link.
I'm gonna stick around a little bit more, but yeah, I've been on for it's over an hour now. But I did have a question.
Sure.
Yeah, I was just wondering. You were talking about like reader response theory. Like to me, like this is like kind of part of like the degradation of like hermeneutics in general. That like reader response theory is essentially the same way that consumer research is conducted, and it's like a very somehow like computerized look at like programming people with narratives, right? So you're looking at like, how does this narrative change people's responses or their opinions on things? And I just only see this as ultimately as serving for the development of effective propaganda. So like, if you're saying that like, climate change literature is in the reader response surveys is like making people answer questionnaires or whatever in a different way. This is the same way that a consumer research study done on a commercial for like cereal will change people's minds about cereal.
Yes, and again, this is not research that I conduct, so I don't want to, risk oversimplifying. The one, book that comes to mind that I've read that engages in reader response, a slightly different version, is Reading the Romance by Radway, and she looks at the ways in which women readers primarily read and read romance novels. It's and so that is not, her purpose was to look at that, usually, not considered high literature genre, and to see how readers were actually engaging in the literature, to see if it got at what we would probably consider more higher level critique, engagement with the narrative. And what she found was a mixed bag, but that she found that readers really did engage with the text in very rich ways, despite maybe what we might anticipate with a very formulaic story.
What is it? What does like engaging it in a rich way mean?
I think that would be some of the things that you were mentioning, in terms of that it's not merely a means of escape, that the readers were engaging with the text in creative and thoughtful ways, that it was leading them to seek out other texts, that it was asking them to think about the world and situation in which that were being presented, the cultures that were being presented, those kinds of elements. It's been a while since I've read Bradway's book. So I'm sorry, I can't give more specifics in terms of the conclusions that she draws.
It's just kind of an axe I have to grind with the state of like literary criticism, is the kind of the like after the pronounced death of the author, it became like you made the audience sacred, and then everything becomes about like audience response to things as determining quality, and what the audience really means is the market response to things. So like that's sort of like where we're at now, right? Where it's like, well, if it sells, it like 100 million people can't be wrong. Like Harry Potter's really popular, it must be good. Like people are really engaged with it, right? I see Harry Potter conventions, and people are dressed up as Harry Potter characters, and there's a Harry Potter theme park, and you can buy Harry Potter. You could deck out your entire life with nothing but Harry Potter merch and Harry Potter branded foodstuffs. But like, I don't really see that as anything but just capitalism.
But Harry Potter becomes a metaphor for all life and all politics. But Logo, let me ask you before you go, do you think that they're sort of resurrecting the author from the grave just to cancel them, right? Like I noticed that's a trend recently. Yeah, they did that to Bret Easton Ellis. Yeah.
It's the hermeneutics of suspicion, right? The author only exists if you can kill him. Like you bring him back to life so that you can like put him on the scaffold.
Exactly. You have to resurrect him from the grave. His
but in this moment, right? It's actually like, this is, I think, how ultimately like authorship has to, like, you have to be someone who is cancelable, right? So you look at like Welbeck or like Nausgard or any of these people. This is like fundamentally the real art in a way, is to like become. It's like you have to play the heel, I guess. And,
yes.
And that in that way, you actually have personhood again. Because you can't crucify a non-existent, like non-dangerous figure. Like you like the only way to exist is as the enemy, which is what Wyndham Lewis describes like as his poetic posture.
And so you think this is a return?
Neil Gaiman? Sorry.
Yeah, that's why I think Neil Gaiman is going to be writing better stuff now.
You think you want Neil Gaiman to write a cancelable work?
Absolutely.
So what do you think about this end cancel culture trend? You actually want cancel culture back? You have Elon Musk and Naval and all these people saying,
like,
I
canceled myself. Like, if you like, I don't care. Like, I think the more people like realize that everyone else's like opinions and stuff like really don't matter, like this notion of like cancelization being possible in the first place is just like having too much faith in the crowd.
Yeah.
But there's two different ways the crowd works, right? Because you have the madness of crowds, but you also have the wisdom of crowds. And I almost feel like you're conflating them, where
I don't believe in the wisdom of crowds.
Well, you have to. Well, that's the George Soros, right? That's the George Soros position. His position is that the market is always wrong, right? And then I actually take the position that the market is always right.
That's like what Taleb says, though.
Like a longer period of time.
But Taleb's whole thing is about how the market's always wrong.
No, but
I'm not sure about that, but that could be possible. But
I think Logo is returning to a model of the enfant terrible in literature and art. I think it's true as another person who will probably never get into a mainstream art gallery in Canada. No way, no how. I think that we have no choice but to sort of ride this nomadic wave, to use again another
Oh.
theory cell delusion metaphor.
I
Right?
forgot. I have it in an art gallery in London, which got protested and
Yeah,
destroyed.
yeah, LD50.
So,
Yeah, so there you go.
I forgot about that.
But that's the thing, right?
J.K.
Like,
Rowling, like the Lord of the Rings, the Fountainhead, like those were organic popularity. Those had organic popularity, right? As opposed
Yeah, they're
to
romances.
someone that was picked and then showered in money, and then because they were showered in money, that's what made them popular. Like according to a Plato's role model, just evolutionary psychology thing, right? Like you can contrive popularity even with certain books. You put it in certain celebrities' hands, you showboat them on the nighttime TV circuit, you can, like it is done from time to time. I think that's what the Drake conspiracy theory is. Like Drake has had the most #1 songs of all time, more than Michael Jackson, more than the Beatles, more than
How is
anybody.
that possible?
Right?
Yeah.
Well, because you can pay to play, right? You can pay the radio DJs to play your music. So Drake has the most #1 hits. And these are such songs such as like No New Friends and all sorts of things that I actually think are psychically stunting. But I think that there's a benefit to prolonging adolescence and to kind of changing people's perspective of what it means to be an adult in the way that the military uses dolphins to train super empathy.
This sounds horrifying to me. I'm not gonna lie. Like, I don't know what like where all the dolphins for like a CIA experiment. Like, I don't know. That does sound pretty accurate, but I don't know. I'm not really
Do they
a
glow in
fan.
I
the
wish
dark?
the CIA, if the CIA is listening, hire me. I would
Yeah.
love to work for you guys.
All right. On that note, I'm gonna head out of here.
all right,
It's been
Logo.
a good one, guys. Peace out.
Thanks for
Love
coming.
you, Logo.
And now I'm going to be possessed by the spirit of Zero H.P. Lovecraft because he is in the chat and he is writing questions. I am going to be his official mouthpiece. So pretend that Zero H.P. Lovecraft is in front of you right now. I'm going to be speaking through him. So his first question that he asked before when we were talking about romances was, let's see, okay, question for Kristen. Isn't it abundantly obvious that the way women engage with romance novels is essentially pornographic, the same way men engage with cam girls?
Ooh. Wow.
There's a scholar that I was a student of when I was in graduate school, Jane Jeffer, who wrote a book called At Home with Pornography, I think, and it looks at women's engagement with pornography. This is, quite honestly, it's beyond my area of expertise in terms of, I haven't researched women's interaction with romance novels. So, that would be a question probably that either Jane Jeffer might know, or I don't think that Radway necessarily goes in that direction, not that I remember in her study. So yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that question.
No, that's okay. Let's see if
can I
there...
ask?
Sure.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
No. I was just looking through the chat to see what else Zero has to say, but first go on, and I'm going to read the chat.
No, I was going to ask, what is, besides sort of modern American literature, you're also a women's studies professor. So what is sort of like your core research and thesis? And maybe a fun question would be, where do you stand on the Susan Sontag versus Camila Paglia debate? I know it's like decades old right now, but whereas it seems that you're more open to these things than the stereotype of a women's professor, right? So Yeah.
Well, I think, in terms of a generation, right, I sort of fall between second wave and third wave. I can't say I'm a little bit older than most feminists who would identify with third wave, or say like I, was born in third wave. And I'm a little bit younger than most women who would, say I came of age as really a second wave feminist.
So you're not like the Dworkin and like McKinnon era, I guess you could say.
Yeah. So, I would say that when I teach, one of the classes that I regularly teach is sort of an introduction to women, gender, and sexuality. And so sometimes we'll use feminist theory class. And so we might look at some of these debates around pornography and feminist responses to pornography. And I just, I like the debate. In terms of, I think that I'd be most supportive of what giving women or any sex worker the support that they need, and I guess I wouldn't say I'm not anti-porn, but I'm not pro-porn either.
Yeah,
like, and to sort of, if I have to like sort of try and position myself.
Yeah, I'm sort of the older, like Brad Thumb sort of opinion of being like anti-sex, not anti-sex. I mean, I think we should help women, obviously, and all that. But I think that the social consequences, I think a good segue would be, because H.P. Lovecraft, he's in the chat. When you read his book, God-Shaped Hole, about women partaking in sex sims and all that, I think that to me, I was almost reading a bit of like Kristeva, like her theory about abjection. I think that a lot of sex work as empowerment to me doesn't sound completely true, in the sense of the abjected body of the feminine becomes not just a vassal for capital, but sort of eroticism in general is being degraded to the point of where eroticism is just this consumerist thing. And so he mentioned in the chat the OnlyFans thing. I think that the OnlyFans reality, again, is another extension of this abjection. I'm trying to, because I was educated in a very continental philosophy program, so I can kind of empathize with a lot of this. I think that a good critique would be to say the abjected body of the feminine outside of horror and literature, to bring it into contemporary commentaries about the society we live in, the over-sex society. But it's not just an over-sex society. That's too simplistic to me. I think as society is over-sexed in terms of ideation and the degradation of the erotic, we're a generation that has like the least amount of actual sex. So that, to me, that is really fascinating, because a lot of literature nowadays, and I would include H.P. Lovecraft's book, short story novella, is dealing with this question of what happens when our experience and our identity itself becomes objected in a virtual plane, right? So yeah, I don't know from your experience if you can comment on contemporary literature with those themes, right? So
yeah, and I didn't have it. I was able to, I read like the first part of The Water Hole fairly carefully, and then I had to skim because I just didn't have enough time to reading it. It was reminding me of, and I'm looking on my bookshelf here because I thought I had a copy. Maybe it's in my office at school. What's it called? The Water? No. It's a science fiction where they have sex robots.
Oh, I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
The Water Girl, or the Water...
Something like that.
Yeah. And so I was just sort of thinking about ways in which, some science fiction, fantasy, experimental literature is interested in these kinds of themes, and thinking about the place of women and technology, bodies and technology.
That is a big theme. Like there is, of course, Donna Haraway. I've read extensively. There's also, who's the writer? I hate the term soft science fiction, because hard science fiction is too, it can be kind of a bit alienating. But what's her name? Ursula K. Le Guin?
Yeah.
She wrote Heart of Dark. Yeah. Within, what was it called? Within Darkness, or
Left Hand of Darkness.
Left Hand of
Thank you.
Darkness. Yeah. She wrote other short stories, but I think that that's another example of the sort of the dystopian literature meets sci-fi meets like the women's perspective, because that was the Society of Androgyny, right, or something like that.
Mhm.
Yeah,
The
but I do
wind-up
know the
It
word
wasn't
you're referring
dystopian,
to.
really, though. It was more extropic.
Yeah,
I wouldn't say it was utopian by any means,
no,
but
it was kind of on the cusp, right?
The Wind-Up Girl was the novel that I was trying to.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. No,
yeah,
go
the
ahead,
Left
go
Hand of
ahead. I'm
Darkness,
just
we've
rambling. I'm
pollinated.
just rambling. Yeah.
In the Left Hand of Darkness, humans have pollinated, and it's like so many thousands of years in the future that there's different just genetic lineages. Just like if you look at the animal kingdom, like within a species, like or within a, like, we're the human race, right, or the human species, but then there's a lot of different subsets on different planets, so they're all on the same genetic tree. But in the Left Hand of Darkness, one of the planets, you have these ambisexual humans, and they go through these cycles, and it's a great thought experiment book. I think that's really what it's mostly about.
Yeah, and that's another thing. That in itself is kind of an older idea. Um, when you look at, for example, the symbolist painters, when they talk about the androgyne and things like that, I think that in its symbolism and alchemy and so forth. But I think that the problem with a lot of contemporary literature is that when you talk about the issues of like identity qua identity as sort of like a reified solid thing, whereas like in a lot of literature previously that dealt with issues of androgyny and so forth, they tend to be a bit more experimental. I think that a lot of people in sort of the outside push back at this, like, for lack of a better term, identity politics, right? But identity politics framed within a very like contemporary, like very reified sort of way. I think that's what people, you know what I mean? Like, I think this is a big problem that sort of has a capacity to stifle creativity and art and so forth. So
I like Super Iron Bob's comment, by the way. So basically, what furries will do when we get CRISPR.
yeah, there you go.
Oh, and HP Zero is back. Zero HP, pardon me. Corn Wainer Smith was famous for his sci-fi epic, The Rediscovery of Man, in which people can change sexes. That sounds a lot like Steven Universe to me.
Okay.
Orson Scott Card wrote a book called Treason, and it's about like a prince is excommunicated from the kingdom, and then I forgot what it was. Either he was in a disease that like slowly, like he would grow body parts, basically. He would like grow extra body parts. And so he'd have to like chop off these extra body parts as they kept growing on him. And at one point he grows breasts, right? And so he, like, for a big portion of the book, like disguises himself as a woman instead of cutting off the breasts. But like meanwhile, like he grows an extra arm, he grows an extra hand, and it's a very odd book. But it becomes very Avatar Last Airbender, where he like meets these shamans, and then he learns like how natural magic works, and he's able to communicate with nature. And then like along with his Avatar Last Airbender powers, he's able to like come back to the kingdom he was betrayed by and excommunicated by, and is able to correct things. Same author as Ender's Game.
Well, Zero HP has another comment, but isn't it ultimately a kind of spiritual lobotomy to imagine that something as simple as flipping the hardware could also somehow transmute a lifetime of lived experience?
That's pretty hot button issue. That's like almost like a Gnosticism in some ways, as like people like Vogelin talk about. But I'm curious to hear the women's studies professor perspective on this.
Well, yeah, I was thinking about, in some ways that's sort of what's happened. It's been a while since I've read Virginia Woolf's Orlando. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but the main character, all of a sudden wakes up and they're the opposite gender.
Oh yeah.
There's also sort of this they're kind of moving through a great span of time at the same time. And so in terms of how literature is what we're talking is how literature thinks through some of these questions. I think that they would say, no, it's more complicated than that. And at the same, that at least in Orlando, that the gendered experience before and what comes after, if I'm remembering the novel correctly, like that past informs the current experience of the present.
And
So
Zero HP says, as Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a thick elf girl.
Oh man, damn! I wish you didn't have audio problems. I'm really curious to hear what you would say. Yeah.
I mean, to do a proper impression, I would have to use like a voice changer. So
yeah,
like
a
voice...
Paul Masvidal vocoder.
Exactly. That's what I'm gonna do next time it doesn't work, so I could switch between Lev and Zero HP. But Kristen, I'm curious about your books. So you wrote Neo-Domestic American Fiction and the American Adrenaline Narrative. So I'm curious about the American Adrenaline Narrative. Like, what exactly? Because again, I didn't have that much of a chance to, because there's no digital copy. But can you talk a little bit about it?
So it looks at adventure, primarily book length, though I look at the way in which the narrative appears in advertising, in social media, in short videos, films. But it primarily looks at memoirs or nonfiction books that deal with extreme adventure narratives, and it looks at what their messages primarily are in terms of the environment. And so identify 5 different representations of nature that these stories exhibit: spiritual, restorative, and risky natures. Those are the 5 different sort of elements that I look at in terms of how nature is represented, and sort of thinking about what are these stories which are set in these, like in the mountains, or, if you spend your summer through hiking the Appalachian Trail or the John Muir Trail, what kinds of environmental messages, but also messages about what it means to be American, because I'm specifically looking at post-1970 because of the rise of extreme sports, but also extreme marketing, right? We can buy extreme detergent, gum, those, all different kinds of things.
Extreme wrestling.
Extreme wrestling, whatever, right? Everything's
wrestling,
extreme. Yeah. And then the rise of what we could probably say the modern contemporary feminist movement, and then also the rise of the modern, first Earth Day is in April in 1970. So I'm kind of looking at that cultural context when extreme and sports, and then these various radical, right, extreme movements are also developing in the U.S. at the same time.
And do you think that in America, I wish Logo was still here because he's really into the American lit scene. Do you think that there is still in contemporary American literature this sort of perennial American fascination with the wild frontier, with like the Turner thesis sort of deal? Like, do you notice that, or do you think that urbanization is like completely closed and it's all over, nature is gone? What do you think?
I think that it's still, very much a touchstone for American identity. And even when we think about like the urban jungle, right? Or I mean, sometimes we naturalize these urban spaces in ways that bring up that sort of idea of a frontier or risky environment in ways that harken back to, like this sort of, maybe this is a good place to maybe mention like David Lynch again or something like that, right? You see a forest and you know bad things are going to happen, right? Yeah.
It always seems to me, I know I'm rambling it because Jillian came back. It seems to me with a lot of, I watch like quite a bit of contemporary Canadian indie films, and they always seem to be, my mother hates them because they're draggy, right? But it seems to me that a lot of contemporary indie films in literature, they tend to have this very draggy quality, but they're always like on the edge of nature. It's always like small, like post-industrial towns that have just been decimated, and there really is no resolution at the end. But there's sort of recognition that when you're on the edge between the burbs and nature, it seems that nature is still, it's gone, but it's in the background. Now it's the nature reclaiming industrial ruins, for example, like urban exploration. I think maybe you would say that contemporary literature also has this, not just film, but literature. It
Yeah,
seems
yeah.
that it's always the edge.
Yeah, that there's still, that draws us in particular ways. And resonates with how, I think it still resonates with, how we are defining, or how we you a kind of symbol or element, a symbol of American identity. Yeah.
Zero HP says, Geo, are you saying we are the virus?
Yeah, I was just thinking that. My God, that nature is healing. We are the virus.
Well, I want to bring things to Jillian. Jillian, you've been here for such a long time. You had very little to say so far. I would love to hear your take, because I sent you some of Kristen's work. So I'm curious what your take is about the combination of gender and these extreme outdoor activities.
Yeah. Okay. So I was looking a little bit at that. What was it? I think you sent it on Google Books, right? So there were, I read through a few pages, but admittedly, you can't, I mean, it would have been impossible for me to read the whole book in that span of time anyway, because you sent it just this afternoon, but it wasn't even available on Google Pages, the entirety of it. So I guess I still am sort of, and I would actually like to hear a little bit more about this too, just how you think this idea of connection with nature or adventure, how do you connect that with gender, or more specifically feminism?
Mm-hmm. I think it's an aspect that traditionally has been associated with a kind of heroic masculinity. And so regardless of what body, regardless of what body is sort of doing the adventure, that it tends to get gendered in a more masculine way, with traits that are associated with masculinity. And some of the athletes, when they talk about, and this is also kind of like extreme sports, like many professional sports have traditionally been male dominated, and so that's part of, I think, that aspect of masculine identity. But in some ways this relates with, may seem weird, like one of my books is about domesticity, and then which is, you might say, hyper, in some ways very hyper feminine, and then I look at these hyper, really found is that there's a lot of flow between these two sort of spaces and how we think about American identity. Because I think another way in which we define American identity traditionally has been through the American family or the American home and what it looks like. And so contemporary literature, I'll try to stay on point and keep with our theme for the right.
That reminds me of like a lot of Laurie Simmons' work in the 70s, where she would like take photos of domestic. But a point I would make about the extremism of a lot of these hypermasculine experiences, because I'm a huge wrestling nerd. I actually wrote an essay on this, and if you go to my blog, look up Content Minded Volume 2, I wrote an essay on death match wrestling. I don't know if you know what this is, but
no, I don't.
It's essentially like hardcore wrestling where they use weapons, but now they're using like broken glass and barbed wire and things like that.
Mercy.
And they're going through fire tables and all this. So I wrote this essay how they're similar to I call them the modern hunger artists, and that these extreme displays and spectacles, very popular in Japan. Japan basically originated this style from America. These extreme displays of sort of hunger art, like I'm referring to the Kafka novel, where it's like he starved himself to death. These extreme displays of hypermasculinity, I find it, the reason I bring this up to make an intelligent point out of something very like lowbrow, to say the least, would be in Japan, they actually have female deathmatch wrestlers. Okay. Believe it or not. There's this one picture this. Her name is Mayumi Ozaki. She is a 51-year-old woman, like not even 5 foot tall, and she is one of the best deathmatch wrestlers in the world. She's been through barbed wire and barbed wire that explodes. But in Japan, this is like totally like not taboo for women to wrestle men, or for women to engage in death matches where they're like covered in blood and broken glass and everything. I think that's really unique, because in America it's like a novelty, right? But it just seems that out of cultural context, these extreme feats of heroism or spectacle, they in a different cultural context, they tend to cross boundaries in terms of race and gender and so forth, right? So I don't know. That's like that may be a really stupid example.
Oh, no, well, Zero
But-
HP has more to say on this. So Zero HP says, but nature itself is always seen as feminine. The Earth Mother, the mother spirit, Gaia as a woman. Man communing with nature is ultimately an attempt to commune with a feminine essence. So I'm curious what you guys think about that.
Yeah.
Kristen,
Maybe conquer. I think of conquering maybe in some way.
Yeah, and sometimes, you know, the what I found was that when nature wasn't represented as feminine, you know, then it was represented maybe using military language or using like technology machines. So like the storm was, you know, like a locomotive, or right, and so again, very sort of masculine. So the
Imagery,
yeah, the nature, when we think of, you know, sort of like the Earth Mother, right, and elements of, you know, definitely feminine, but I think when we there's this other side too of nature that we also, I think, also associate with the masculine, and so the occasionally there would be more, what I would say, it's less rare in the literature that I was looking at, but there would be androgynous, right? So often, right, so sometimes a writer would talk about mother nature or father nature, right? Sometimes they would talk about both, and sometimes it would be they would use the pronoun it, and purposely not gender nature.
Right.
Other times the gender came through, I think, yeah, in terms of the terminology and descriptions, and whether or not that would be, you know, considered more feminine or more masculine.
well, Zero says, do you
Oh,
think...
here's a pretty banger of a question coming up.
Here we go, okay. Do you think that women deterritorializing traditional male spaces has an effect of denaturing masculine identity? Can that be harmful to men?
I think that if I'm understanding, would this be the let me see if I can see the language.
It's to me it seems similar as like they break it all down to like build it up like slightly different, but I think that can kind of go in many like different pervasive directions, because I do think, like, I hate the phrase toxic masculinity.
I hate it too. I hate it.
Overused. I think it's way overused, but there are kernels of truth there, right? I think that a lot of people are very bad at diagnosing or addressing or even correcting stuff like that, but it's almost like they've done a chemotherapy where you're killing a lot of healthy cells with the cancerous cells, when it'd be much better to have like a more targeted vaccine so you could just avoid the chemo at all. Yet I do think some of this deterritorializing of masculinity has been kind of like a cultural chemotherapy to actual toxic masculinity.
He also he also writes, by the way, is destruction fine if it's equal opportunity?
No.
Interesting.
Well, I don't know what that means.
No, but I think what to sort of define deterritorialization, this is the Deleuzian concept of where you sort of have a molarity or a buildup, a bricolage of culture. It's really simple, really butchering cultural content on a plane of consistency. So you have a sedimentary buildup of different signifiers and different motifs and symbols. When you start to sort of break free of those arrangements, and sort of deterritorialization means you sort of expand the territory and you break free these assemblages and brickolages of, for example, the signifier of what it means to be man in male spaces, so in sports and so forth. When you sort of expand those and you sort of deconstruct those cultural signifiers and those symbols and the essence of what it means to be within a male space, that's what HP is getting at. When you start to do that and you start to expand the definition of masculinity, because what is masculinity but a, this is Heideggerian, right? Spatial temporal existence in the world. When you start to sort of, when a lot of contemporary culture discourse invades those spaces and starts to expand them and break them free of their original traditional meanings within a space of the masculine, I think what HP is getting at is that then you start to actually degrade what it means to be within the masculine, this sort of solar masculine, as opposed to the chthonic earthbound feminine to begin with. And that has a lot of different cultural consequences that we're seeing right now. And so that's really, like, again, a theory cell way of like explaining it. I agree with his analysis, by the way, but yeah.
Yeah, and do you think that would you say that gender is more biologically constructed, culturally constructed, or do you think that it's a mishmash?
Well, I'm gonna get canceled either way with that.
Well, I think that's a language game for most people, because I've heard satisfactory answers for both, that it's a cultural construct or it's a biological construct, and a lot of it just has to do with people's agreement of terms, right? It's like when you're writing a contract with someone, like a lot of times you have to define terms in the contract so that people aren't debating, well, this word actually means this, or well, this word actually means this. And I think a problem with society is people are trying to have like a litigious conversation when it shouldn't be one.
But then there's also sorry.
Yeah.
I just wanted to quickly put this stat in here. In Sweden, 1,500% rise was documented in gender dysphoria for teen girls aged 13 to 17, and this was between 2008 and 2018. And what
when they implemented the policies,
yeah. But what I'm curious about here is how much of that was just peer pressure, as opposed to them finding out that they're in the wrong body. And how much does that have an effect on society at large?
Well,
I think gender is a construct, but I also think people with gender dysmorphia are going through an identity crisis. And you wouldn't, if an anorexic person was said, I identify as fat, you wouldn't encourage them to get a liposuction, right? And I think that is kind of a problem that we see among a lot of youth, where you have children saying they identify a certain way, and then you're pumping them full of hormones, and in some cases letting them go through with sex change operations. And I think that
before we get into that,
there are trans trenders, right? And then there are people that have legitimate gender dysphoria who should undergo some treatment for that, most definitely.
I think it's fine to identify any way you want. I really believe gender is a construct, but nothing changes your chromosomes. So if you want to say, is it Blair White?
Blair White, yeah, she's great.
She's great. I like her. She's great on this subject. So is Andre Pajic.
Oh, I don't
Andreas Pajic now. I forgot her name. But
and
I think there are people that.
But Blair White's legitimate.
Are better communicators about the reality than sort of the social justice warrior woke crowd that I feel like is really just into a social engineering legal game.
Well, transgender, that's what they call it.
An unnegotiable gender term.
Well, I think, we could get into that with Blair White. But to answer,
a whole other thing, right?
That's a whole other. To answer Professor Jacobson's question, I'm sort of going to get canceled either way. I have to maintain the trad Twitter kayfabe. I believe that there definitely is a biological basis for sex and gender, obviously, but I believe that there is when gender when they the problem I think is that when people say gender is a social construct, I do believe that gender is in large part a construct, but I believe that there is a deeper essentialism, an archetypal spiritual essentialism to our embodied experience as engendered beings. I think that even if there is a level of social constructivism, there still is a resonance with a very deep-seated recognition of a what I truly believe is a spiritual aspect to our identities and our genders and so forth. So that's a really good way of sort of weaseling out being canceled by my friends on Twitter and canceled by larger society.
Well, because I think you'd mentioned that you were Jungian, right? And so, and that aspect of the collective unconscious. So I was sort of curious in terms of how that informed your ideas and understanding of gender too.
This I think is a problem I feel with people on my side, is that there tends to be, for good reasons, because it's to compensate from the wider what some people would call the quote unquote gynocentric society around us, to compensate with that by I know it's a really cringy manosphere term, but whatever, to compensate with that by having a very extensive worship of the masculine. I believe that there is an anima aspect to our being that is just as integral to our experience as a man, as opposed to the masculine side of a woman. I do believe that, but I believe that society has sort of, again, we live in a society. I believe that society has gone over to the point of a very, shall we say, unbalanced feminine that is in lack of individuation. And I believe the masculine has sort of been sidelined in a lot of ways. And I think that's a way of addressing. But I do get your point. As a Jungian, I do strongly feel that the anima part of a man's being has to be integrated into the collective whole, and it has to be reconciled and dealt with. And I think that as much as I love vitalism and nudist bodybuilder sort of pursuit of this masculine ideal, I do think that the feminine is being neglected, and it's very hard to see because society is so swayed towards the feminine. When you're in this more esoteric political side of Twitter, it becomes very difficult to reconcile the feminine, I believe. But you know what? But then again, this is to compensate for what's happened in this greater social picture, which is an invasion of male spaces and a degradation of the masculine, right?
Yeah, there has to be better ways to give Chads better female intuition, right?
Absolutely.
Like I think there's like been this push to like demasculinize things, and it's almost been maybe due to like a Victorian frustration that I think a lot of dyadic pairs go through, when it often seems like men and women like become more and more incompatible like the older they get, and they're more and more alone together the older they get, and they're like, it's like men are from Mars, women are from Venus. And I think that there are ways to bridge those divides and share more understanding and like demystify a lot of this stuff without this like chemotherapy approach where you're was the term cucking everyone to the point of right. I don't know if that probably only made half sense, but I'm trying.
But Kristen, do you see what Gio was also talking about as far as there being this almost shamefulness about masculinity today in popular culture, in academia?
I feel like the shame is sorry.
No, go ahead, Jules.
I really feel like the shame has to do with the lack of female intuition, and I think a lot of men take this for granted. It reminds me of.
What do you
also,
mean?
I find this with Sunny, Vedic cyber god, and he pronounced, he's like, I'm a fascist, to challenging one of our other guests who was like anti-fascist. And then the cyber god says, could you even define fascism? And Gennady gives a perfect definition. And then, he goes, and then he says, well, that's not my definition. That's what the cyber god says. And then Gennady says, okay, what's your definition? And then the cyber god says, I don't have to give you my definition, right? And it's kind of like, it's kind of like an unsatisfying back and forth, but that is how reality works. Like, if you meet contentious people outside, like, it's not this neat little sandbox where like everyone just agrees to like be agreeable, right? Like, you can meet intransigent people who just like are committed to not getting along because they feel like it, right? And so what are you going to do with that? And I think there are some aspects of like what people consider to be masculine identity, which is like you can't change, you are your own man, right? And there's almost like this feminine association to being persuaded at all, or changing your mind, or opening your mind, right? It's almost like it's misassociated with.
Jillian's making some faces, so Jillian, I'm curious what you think, and then this is the perfect opportunity to also introduce Delicious Tacos, who is joining us.
Yeah.
What's up, you guys?
Hey.
What's up, Tacos?
Hey.
I've only heard like 45 seconds, but you guys sound like nerds. What the fuck are you talking about with this, whatever. I mean, look, good people are smart and thinking about smart things. I write books about pussy and shit like that, so I might not be qualified to engage in this philosophical discussion of masculinity.
You're in the right place. You're in the right place.
Oh, this is gonna be amazing.
So no, I just I guess I was making those faces because I'm thinking as far as if we're talking specifically about stereotypes that are associated with masculinity or stereotypes that are associated with femininity, I guess I kind of see where Jules is coming from, this sort of idea of masculine steadfastness, and this sort of just being like so sure of yourself that you don't need to change or be persuaded. I guess I kind of see where he's coming from with that, but I also don't necessarily, that's not a stereotype I would, and that's not the first thing that would come to my mind when I think of stereotypes that are associated with masculinity, I guess. So that's why I was thinking that.
Yeah, it's a bad generalization because I've met women like that as well. So I think it's actually a bad.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are people that are just generally stubborn and insecure, and that's really it. Yeah.
Well, Tacos, as far as literature goes, one question that I was asking the panel before was what direction has contemporary mainstream literature gone in the past decades? And do you see communities that your work resonates with the most as going with that flow, against it, or somewhere in between? So in your case, well, go for it.
Sorry, please finish.
No,
it's okay. It's kind of a meaningless question because literature in the last decade is so irrelevant. And the movements that we're talking about, the communities that you mentioned, are so tiny that none of it really means anything. Also, 10 years is a very short span of time in literature. It's a very, very long span of time in technology and, social networks and stuff like that. I mean, 10 years ago, really, Twitter kind of didn't exist. But in literature, I don't know. I don't know what contemporary literature even is. It's sort of bifurcated in my mind into commercial literature. In other words, back when I was working in Hollywood and I had to be aware of what was being published, it was very much young adult, weird, sexy shit for young adults having sex with supernatural beings. That was when Twilight was coming out. That was when 50 Shades of Grey was first coming out. And then also there was this giant genre of, girls or women's coming of age stories where they have to choose between a banker in Manhattan or an artist. The book has a pink cover and high heels on it. I mean, that stereotype was real and it's not that old. Right. But in terms of literature with a capital L, like substantive literature, the only books that I've read that have been written in the last 10 years are by Sam Pink or Michelle Houellebecq or Alice Munro. But I mean, she's 1,000 years old. She's not an example of somebody contemporary. But for some Twitter jerk off, my books are pretty popular, and yet functionally no one reads my fucking books. I have no effect on the culture. The biggest book of our scene is probably Bronze Age Mindset, which has a larger effect than, you know, he sold a tremendous amount of books, but a tremendous amount of books compared to even the, you know, shittiest episode of Rachel Maddow in terms of, you know, audience is tiny. And you don't write literature for the present, really. That's the thing. I mean, you write it, you know, because you certainly don't get a lot of fucking riches out of it in the present, but you write it hoping to contribute something to the canon, so that somebody, you know, if America turns out to be somewhat like Rome, and, you know, then enough copies of it will get passed around that they're teaching it in some, you know, junior high school class in 2000 years.
Imagine, I'm just thinking, like, finally some good news. Your novel, like, that will be teached in high school, hyper high schools in like 1,000
Yes,
years.
as it should be. I mean, it is very,
Yeah,
it
it's a
is
great
very
book.
much of our time. I mean, if you want to know what our time is like for somebody like me, that book will tell you exactly. I should take this moment to plug my novel. Finally, some good news is on Amazon. My new book is called Savage Spear of the Unicorn.
The
And
Savage what of the Unicorn?
Savage Spear of the Unicorn. Thank you.
Oh yes.
And you know, people listening to this should buy it, because then I will get money. That's what we all want, I think.
Shameless plug indeed.
Yes.
Absolutely.
What's appropriate age group for your book? My old elementary school's mascot is the unicorn.
If you want
I would recommend it to them if I won't get in trouble.
I would say children as young as 5 can easily read the process and enjoy my book. I think for a school, you definitely want to purchase at least 300 to 500 copies at full retail price. And then,
you'll get put in a federal watch list.
Yeah, you'll absolutely. The chapter titles are like "fuck, cunt, pussy," when I have anal sex with my fucking intern or whatever. So don't.
Gotta know about the world. The earlier, the better.
Anybody who has read my books is not
Reality's
allowed
hard.
within 1,000 feet of an elementary school.
So today, millennials are having a lot less sex than they used to, and in a way, like, your work harkens back to a different era. Like, I don't know, like, Kristen, today's woke...
It's because he's a boomer, man.
Yeah, like, today's woke culture wouldn't take as kindly to that kind of language in books, or am I mistaken? Like, or is there a middle ground here?
So this is a question that I was thinking about before this show, and I'll let the other panelists weigh in too. But it doesn't, like, a lot of people in our sphere talk about cancellation. Oh, we're going to get, the media is controlled by SJWs, and we're going to cancel. Like, I was pre-canceled. I was already writing shit that had no audience and was offensive and could be considered to be marginally racist, at the same time that the entire publishing industry is the wokest of the woke.
Wokest of the woke.
Wealthy Ivy League white women, with ridiculous, literature factories to create fucking fake diversity or whatever they're doing. But it doesn't really matter. It's never been something that I never even considered submitting my book to fucking Alfred A. Knopf, so it's a non-issue. And my books, even from a commercial point of view, I mean, the audience is only so large for fuck, cunt, pussy, right? Like, people want to read James Patterson. So
I think anyone who'd want to read Fight Club would want to read what you write. Very similar.
Thank you. Yes, I wish I could get the same kind of...
I'm just saying, like, I was reading your stuff, and I think it's a very similar sort of style. Like, the content is similar, and I think the writing style is too. I think it's really good.
Thank you.
That's the thing about reading Delicious Tacos. I think that
I got to read it. I'm really excited.
But behind, like, the whole aura of, like, a quote-unquote sex blog turned into literature, I think there is a deep consciousness there, and there's a lot of similarities there to, like, Easton Ellis and things like that. So, not to fanboy you, because I have read a lot of yours.
Thank you. Well, that's another thing, is, like, there's a layer of I'm people who have not actually read my stuff. Like, I have a persona that doesn't really exist, right? Because any guy that talks a lot, you assume it's sort of about machismo or PUA stuff, and it's more emotional than that. But I'm absolutely guilty of playing to the persona, because that's kind of what you have to do if you market yourself, right? It's like Howard Stern used to get in new cities by having like lesbian dial-a-date and all this other horseshit. And then if you actually listen to like Howard Stern's radio show, it's him arguing with Gary over, you know, Chinese takeout, or them talking, or, you know, him and Robin talking about politics. So you kind of have to, you do have to have a little sizzle. And I have not, you know, like if people wanted to come after me for being right-wing or being sexist or encouraging date rape or any of these things, you know, that's not true. None of them are true per se, but I fucking made my own bed. I mean, I certainly didn't discourage people from thinking that.
Oh man, this is very spicy.
50 Shades of Grey is like one of the most is like a toxic feminine fantasy, right? As in, we're talking about toxic masculinity. 50 Shades of Grey is actually like a toxic female fantasy, because how it works is she does nothing, she brings nothing to the table. She's like really vapid, and then you have this billionaire come out of nowhere, and he's like, I want to do everything for you. Like, I'm just gonna like do everything.
That's
and
you know, at the same time, that sounds like the fantasy of someone coming out of nowhere and doing everything for you is universal. I would like that to happen as well. I don't think that's a particularly gendered fantasy.
I went on a date with.
What do you think the mommy GF thing is about? Right?
Female fantasy more than it is for men, probably.
Yeah, but I mean, let women have their toxic fantasy. You know, I don't think anybody's reading 50. This is, you know, you can. I think it's a mistake to do like tit for tat, because men are accused of obviously toxic masculinity. No. You're encouraging all this terrible shit, and like really, like you can, like there's, you know. I wouldn't accuse 50 Shades of Grey of changing anyone's behavior, except maybe some Midwestern housewife, you know, asking her husband to fucking whack her ass with a ping pong paddle once in a while.
No, I mean, I agree. I don't think it should be necessarily called out. Or I don't think anyone should say, oh, there's something wrong with this female fantasy, because obviously there's nothing wrong with it and it sells. And if that's a female fantasy, that's completely fine. There's nothing wrong with that. The point is, though, I think if you're gonna call out toxic masculinity at every turn, or if you're gonna point out, you know, things about stereotypical masculinity that you think are problematic, I think equally you should be able to do that with femininity as well. I'm not saying stop either. I'm saying just don't only attack one.
At this point, though, nobody, and I mean exactly 0 people with no exceptions, nobody who is, quote, calling out toxic masculinity, close quote, is doing it sincerely. It is always 100% of the time a gimmick to sort of go along with this long sort of genre, this cliche that it's sort of a sui generis like genre of clickbait horseshit. Now there really is such a thing as toxic
or clickbaity.
It's always mercenary, because it's always an attempt to fit into a collective. I don't know how to describe it, but you know what I'm talking about. Like, you know, shit that's in the Guardian. Nothing that's been in the Guardian in the opinion section for the last 5 years has represented anyone's true thoughts or emotions at all. So and that's sort of the pinnacle of people complaining about toxic masculinity, right? I mean, maybe there's one hardcore.
There have to be people that really think that, right?
There are not people that truly think that are expressing that in a way that's intellectually interesting or emotionally true. Like, say what you will about Andrea Dworkin, she was intellectually interesting, and what she wrote was emotionally true. So whether or not you agree with it, she believed it, right? And there is no Dworkin today. There are only shills. And so feminism has suffered more than anyone from the sort of cheapness and commercialization of I don't want to call it even intellectual life, but, you know, sort of like fluff literature and opinion pieces, because there's no real sort of feminism being done, right?
Like think piece, like Jessica Valenti, Laura Duca, sort of stuff.
That kind of stuff.
I mean, look, not that I know what feminist scholarship is going on out there, but what I encounter is horseshit 100% of the time, right? So there's no, like, you know, Susan Faludi would be another example, but she's still alive and she's now kind of generating horseshit. Although once in a while you read something new of hers and like she still like she's at least a good writer with interesting ideas, and she tries to connect with the emotional truth of things. But it, you know, they're just like there isn't a lot of vitality going on there. And look, I'm sure fucking feminists would hate me if they read me, so maybe it's good that their movement is bankrupt. But
well, we're in a very interesting position right now because I think, like, you know, we're lucky enough to have Dr. Jacobson here, who is a gender studies professor. So I'm very interested. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'm very interested if you can comment on what Tacos was talking about.
Yeah, haters can give you a distorted view of how popular you actually could be. Like, there was a chance that you might be projecting that feminists or like female-minded, female-centric readers would like be universally disgusted by your writing, and that could distort your perspective if like your haters are the most vocal, and people that like you or just like take it mildly or like, you know, with guilty pleasure, like are less likely to send you a message that goes, hey man, like this was awesome. You know what I mean? So
well, I'm blessed enough that I do get those messages. But I'm sorry, Dr. Jacobson, I would be interested to hear your thoughts.
Well, I think for me, what I find most interesting about the feminist movement right now is that it isn't just one movement, and I think this has its advantages and disadvantages. I think that there are aspects, particularly of third wave feminists, who've resisted trying to be a spokesperson for third wave feminism, for the feminist movement, right? And instead have tried to do their actions more collectively, or to try and say, look, these are all the people, right? As opposed to making it about an individual personality. And so, you know, so some of it is that there's a great diversity of views. And so based on that diversity of views and the people who self-identify as feminists, I imagine you would have a great diversity of views of readers who would, of self-identified readers who would respond to your text. So I think in that sense, what Jillian was saying is that, yeah, like as you know, as one feminist among what I still think are many, my students both identify and don't identify with feminism when you know, when we talk about it personally, would call themselves a feminist, and why.
I was just looking at the screen. I'm like, oh man, Professor Jacobs is going to be mortified at this stuff. But to further, I think what DT is trying to say is that there has sort of been a commodification with the sort of think piece industry, where there tends to not be a lot of sincerity in terms of these very bombastic headlines about, like, just the other day I saw this one in the Independent, or was it the Sun, that says, well, more men die of coronavirus. Oh, sure. I didn't want to say it because of the YouTube. More men die of the virus. That means that just proves the strength of women there. I mean, you know what they're doing, right? Like this is the clickbait industry. But I think that further than that, there tends to be a commodification and a sort of, shall we say, status industry competition with a lot of, like, what would you, like, there's terms for it that even a lot of professors use, like, what do they call it? Like capitalist feminism or girl boss feminism, that type of stuff. I think that's what DT is getting at. Whereas,
like the idea of like lean in, that
listen, believe, lean in, that type of stuff that's really unproductive in general, because where is this generation's Susan Sontag or Andrea Dworkin, or well, Camila Paglia is still around, but I mean, she's pretty much, you know, that's another topic of controversy right there.
She's kind of been canceled in a lot of spaces too.
But she is the original cancel queen. I mean,
I know she's. I'm a huge fan, actually. I think she's phenomenal.
But even a lot of academic literature that gets passed around, I noticed this because a lot of my research academia dealt with Michel Foucault and his more middle to later period with power, knowledge, and so forth. A lot of, like, I truly believe that a lot of academic discourse even has suffered from this commodification, or this sort of think piece, thinkfluencer aspect where they take critical theory and they sort of mash it into a paste that becomes activism. And when theory becomes activism, there's always those there's always those integers that get distorted. And so, for example, when you talk about de Beauvoir and the second sex, then you go from down there to bell hooks and oh, what's her name? I forget. But the point being is that a lot of activist orientated literature leaches into the sort of think piece industry. And this is where this perception of cancel culture and so forth, it's really a degradation of the high mindedness, in my opinion, in art, literature, and academia, because often these things are very intertwined. I mean, we all know that literature is intertwined with academia, right? So, yeah, I think that's my adding on to what DT is trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
In a less bombastic way.
Yeah, and I guess as I'm listening and thinking about what you both are saying, you know, in this sense, the feminist movement and I guess whatever you would consider the anti-feminist movement, right, and the way in which that media circuit, right, festival, you know, so like and how those spokes persons get placed in front, you know, whether it's their own op-ed pieces, and so I think that there's the aspect of the, you know, in some ways we're seeing maybe a similar kind of media mechanisms that are operating, you know, on the left and the right.
Well, Mr. Dupe was mentioning depopulation capitalism, where what I'm curious about here is I don't know how many people have seen Idiocracy by Mike Judge, but what's very interesting to me about that movie is that it portrays stupider people having more kids while smarter people who want to work on their careers having less kids. And the idea of being, you know, like a strong, independent woman who doesn't need no man, you know, and all that. When we talk about what the future is for people who would pass on good qualities to their kids, you know, good moral qualities, good work ethic, things like that. The fear that I think that movie was showing is that the people who would be able to contribute the most to that have been empowered to focus more on the office job, more on the career, so that passing on of the next generation gets much more limited. And I guess, for lack of a better word, the conspiracy theory that people would talk about here would involve having a population that's much easier to control over time. As far as if you have a bunch of stupid people, they'll be much easier to manage, much easier to control, and that's the thing that people fear the most, where there's like an upper caste, and then there's the permanent lower class that's not able to rise up.
Not necessarily control, but to submit in a different way, as in if people don't understand how the institutions work, if people don't understand how the legal processes work, like you need people to fill the legal system. You need judges, you need juries, you need lawyers, right? And if everyone stops understanding how all that stuff works, it breaks down. Maybe you replace it with something else. So when you listen to these accelerationists, and like, I think there's a lot of different brands, and some of them say we should just like accelerate the breakdown of society because there's all this rot, so we can like build something back up. I don't think that stupid people are easier to control. They're actually much harder to control, but it's much easier to justify dominating them, right? As in, if you want to clamp down with authoritarian suppression, you're like, look at these wild horses, right? Like, they're so unreasonable. I can't even reason with them. They're so stupid, right? So then you just come in with just supreme force, right? But I think that is, I thought Idiocracy was a horror film about intelligent design.
I forget who coined the term. I think it was either Nick Land or Spandrel. That, what do they call it? IQ shredder, where it's like modern capital will like direct all the rich people upwards, and like all the dumb people will be the ones having kids. I don't know whether to play stock in like the whole IQ like the validity in terms of like the
Well,
hard and fastness of it.
Mr. Dupe said, regardless of IQ, Mr. Dupe says, have the genius people fund the stupid, violent people to encircle the middle and enslave it. So that is also
classic,
a common theme,
yeah,
like
greengrocer theory, yeah.
the war of the upper class and the lower class against the middle class, where in the
Become
end...
Become a patron, 11
Yes,
Joules.
patreon.com/11joules. Well, I'm interested in delicious tacos. I'm curious what you think about my reasoning here as far as what the future looks.
That we're going to enslave the middle class. me as part of the crazy unrestrained wild man. I'm going to help going to connect with some of my rich overlords to encircle and enslave the middle class. That sounds awesome. It doesn't mean I get to have a lot of kids.
True vitalism.
Right. I'm a childless 44-year-old man, which I kind of regret, but must mean that my IQ is high at least.
IQ is bogus, isn't it? I thought IQ is like judging a fish for its ability to like go up a hiking trail.
Well, that's not bold.
That's what people say when they do badly on an IQ test. I mean, it's something, it's a proxy for something. But yes, it's true. Like I think, I don't think a depopulation agenda is. I don't think there's some master plan to turn us into Morlocks and Eloi. But I think if Bill Gates does have a sinister depopulation agenda to reduce population of the world, that's good. I hope he accomplishes it. I think what he's trying to do is educate young girls, especially in the third world, which is how you peaceably and slowly depopulate without mass famine. I support the Illuminati and their satanic plan to deprive the human race of future children. I mean, I wrote a book in which about probably at least 5 billion people are killed in a nuclear exchange and or nuclear holocaust, and it's called Finally Some Good News. I support global depopulation and rewilding of natural spaces, and I'm doing my part by fucking destroying my sperm with cocaine for 20 years and pulling out.
Yeah, but I noticed.
Kristen, hold on. I have to say, Kristen, I met one of Bill Gates' big propagandists. He owns a company called Phantom Firm, and he told me Bill Gates made me rich. And like one of the things he does is propaganda for population control in Africa. So I have firsthand, like from the horse's mouth, knowledge, experience of like aspects of this speculative agenda that I don't think people will ever really be able to pinpoint. But I'm also, I guess we can talk about this later. I was curious if you know anything about Christina Summers, the author of The War Against Boys.
Can I interject here? Your friend who's the propaganda minister encouraging depopulation in Africa is doing a terrible job. I think Nigerian women have an average of like 13 children. So Bill Gates is completely fucking wasting his money on these propaganda efforts. I believe you though, that like he's trying to but it's hard. Like it's hard. Africa is hard to penetrate with like white people's do-gooder public health shit, right? Because they have a very strong, natural, and well-earned distrust of horse shit that they're given. So when they went in there and tried to do, back when, back in the peak of the AIDS crisis, when they were trying to do public health education there, people told them to fuck off, as they should have, because the last 100 times that, some, white guy came to the village and told them some shit, it was horse shit to steal their goods or enslave them.
So well.
And I think, God only knows that might happen with the depopulation agenda too. I think Bill Gates' program will get there, and then people in Namibia will start having 50 kids.
I think it's done. I think that the tide is turning. I think that that there's more of a desire for like community leaders and people to figure out how to optimize systems. Because the argument for the depopulation in Africa is you have 1 billion people over there in like squalid conditions, and they're suffering. So if they were reproducing less, you'd be able to manage it better and lift them out of poverty faster. But I actually think it's a systems problem. And I think the reason why I think that's actually immoral and not a moral calculation is because instead of fixing the systemic problems and optimizing it in a way that a rising tide raises all ships, you're basically committing to a broken suboptimal system and saying, like, let's just work with this pit in the pendulum Malthusian problem and just go in that direction. And I think it's Jules, the wrong way.
But that's the thing, to add to Delicious Taco's point. I think that the problem is that we're talking about things in terms of utility, and people in Africa have a different cultural understanding with us in terms of their place and being in the world. And sort of when you take, and again, to mention Giorgio Agamben again, when you sort of reduce people down to bare life, to homo sacer, where they're just become population dots on a board, then things tend not to work out good. And it's funny he mentions the history of colonialism, that there still is a consciousness there, and it's reflected in art and literature. And certainly there's a growing African literature scene, as we know, around Nigeria and places like that. But no, I think this is pretty interesting, because before DT came on, we were talking about dystopian literature and our obsession with it. But it seems that, to me, having been within and following the conspiracy movement since for God knows how long, it seems that fiction, or rather the speculative nature of conspiracies, that has invaded our temporal timeline, and they're becoming slowly true over, not only are they becoming true over time, but they're becoming true hyperstitionally. We know that the world is run by satanic pedophiles, and that we know this, but yet it seems that as crazier the imagination of people like Alex Jones become, the more hyperstitionally these events become true because of the digital age and so forth. And then another point before I leave off is that, DT, you mentioned about you not having children. I noticed reading a lot of your stuff, there is this primal longing and lament and regretfulness at not expressing yourself in that traditionally masculine way of having a family and children. And I think that's why a lot of outsider alternative literature like Delicious Tacos is important, because people, they look at this stuff and they're like, oh, that's just like Tucker Max, that's just a fuck blog or whatever. But there's something deeper there that I think is expressive, not just in your work, but a lot of these like weirdos we interact with on Twitter and so forth. There's a lot of that sort of deeper stuff going on that I find just fascinating. So
I would be worried about
for a lot of people.
I would be worried. I don't think you can safely say that our government or whatever is run by satanic pedophiles. And there's a much stronger chance that if you have people pulling strings, that they would insulate themselves from people who are pedophiles. It reminds me a lot of when like Lev invited some people on who were like making very uncomfortable comments about Jewish people in the media. Right. And Gennady and Lev are both saying, like, we hate this garbage. We don't support this garbage. Right. But they're recognizing what I think is a false pattern. They see a group of people who are populating a certain area or industry, and then they come to a false conclusion. Oh, look, that's a conspiracy. When something like that is much more likely to be a scapegoating, like decoy to make it harder to pick out and differentiate between good actors and bad actors.
So, Jules, you're saying that the Jews.
Wait.
Sorry.
Yeah, Delicious Tacos. Go for it.
Jules, you're saying that the Jews in the media are a front for the satanic pedophiles?
No.
I just want to
say. I'm saying that scapegoat. Look, I'm saying that people need to be very wary of scapegoating, and scapegoating shouldn't be tolerated. And I think if you do have, look, I think people on the left are sympathetic to a lot of this stuff that the right is more repulsed by. I think there's a campaign to debate the age of consent so that it's something like France or Germany, And then I think people want to have discussions like, can we make animation porn? Can we have robots? Like, you know,
Like
you have these
Wall-E?
people who
Wait,
are, you have people
is
that
there a real campaign to change the age of consent?
I think there is, but if I pointed it out,
But
I might have a
I-
frustrating conversation where they become very woolly and and gaslight me, right? But that doesn't mean like I can't see with my own eyes and like aggregate an accumulation of observations and like think about like and deduct what people's intentions are, especially the more and more and more information they share. Like I think that there is a campaign to be able to have what has traditionally been an explosive, dead on arrival conversation and to bring compassion into it so
what,
that people
like
can
the
be
map community
smart.
or something?
It's like we didn't ask to play a game with Jigsaw here, and it's a bad. And I think some people who want to play this game, like it's kind of like a scary escape room where you know you gotta do the Rubik's cube just right because otherwise you're beset on all sides, right? You have no friends or no allies anywhere, right? Because a one man operation really for a lot of people when they're trying to do this stuff. So I do think that there is a campaign to open up that dialogue, but I think it's very naive to assume that you have a situation like I think Stanley Kubrick said when he made Eyes Wide Shut before it released when he died of a heart attack or whatever.
When he was when he was heart attacked.
That's right.
No, I don't know. No, that's ridiculous.
Wait, delicious tacos.
Let's not do that.
Wait, delicious tacos.
Stanley Kubrick said that society was run by pedophiles. That's what Stanley Kubrick said before he died. But I also think it's just as likely, if in the unlikely scenario something like that is true, that people that are higher up pulling the strings probably wouldn't be engaging in it at all.
No, it would be the people who would be compromised.
No, but you got to engage with it to have power to begin with.
Yeah, you have people that are compromised below you so that if there's like a scapegoating misfire, like you're never touched.
Sure, but then there could also be people who are rich and poor.
Everyone should just be very careful.
This all sounds real complicated, man. Yeah, who knows? This is all. Look, the world is not run by satanic pedophiles, but it might as well be. I don't believe any of these conspiracy theories, but it's a rich metaphor, right? Like I worked in Hollywood for 10 years, and I don't believe that there's like satanic pedophile rings in Hollywood. However, I think the idea of a sinister cabal of sort of venal people who collectively, even unintentionally, just create a bunch of garbage that erases your mind is satanic pedophiles is a decent metaphor.
Like the reptilians and so forth.
Yes, exactly.
I like Satanism. Satanism's not all bad. Diane, what's wrong with Satan? LeVay's Satanism is great.
I think
there's some good Satanism.
I think the
age
of consent will be changed to 28 before it's changed to 17. I don't think that they're ever going to get any more.
Think the what?
I think the age of consent will be changed to 35. I mean, right now I think the age of consent is in Kentucky, though.
Well, do you think it's because we're heading into a more neo-Puritan type of deal, or like what?
Who knows? Yeah, I think that like it's a hard thing. Anything that sort of restricts sexuality is a hard thing to vote against. Restricts male sexuality and male sexual predation.
And since
my problem with these laws is you make a lot of the monsters you intend to protect us from, right? As in, if like the reason why you have these monster pedophiles who will like abduct a kid, have their way with them, and then murder the kid is because the crime is so severe. As opposed to like if you could have some kid robots, you could do some kid VR, and some weirdo like wants to hold a baby under supervision. Like these are not things that like give me horror. I'm not like, oh my God, this is horrible. The problem that I have is you make these draconian laws so that they only target the low-hanging fruit, right? And then the big dogs just skirt.
Yeah, but Jules, don't you find something so severely wrong with and this is covered in a lot of like speculative stuff where you have like, I don't know, horrible people getting to indulge in fantasies with like VR ports or whatnot. Like to me, that just there's something alienating towards the human condition. Like for example, in again to bring up H.P. Zero Lovecraft's novella, he has in the future he speculates in his work of fiction that you will get to like rape sex robots and they will have a inborn resistance codex and things like that. To me that just seems like call me a mindless trad or whatnot, but it seems that when you introduce those things within the, shall we say, psychic spiritual bloodstream of humanity, there's something that is fundamentally degrading to our experience and our being in the world when you start to say, well, it's okay, as long as you're not going after real children, then they could draw lolly and things like that. To me, it's just, I can't agree with that whatsoever.
So from the
let's make Quentin Tarantino.
Here we go. So Gio was talking about there being this psycho-spiritual reality that we're living in. And I happen to believe that. As far as imagining that this is all like a simulation or whatever you want to call it, I could see that the thought, just like the Zoroastrians have the idea of like good deeds, good thoughts, and I forgot the third one, but good thoughts is one of them, meaning that I think we do shape reality through what we think about. And if there was some kind of a VR game that we were to go into, how are we sure this isn't another game? And it's like a game on top of a game on top of a game, and whatever choices you see what I mean, like whatever choices we're making in this game is going to affect what's going to happen to us later on, the kind of person we grow up to be. So that's why I think it is important to sure, like sex and violence, and that's always going to exist, and there probably are certain pressure valves, but the idea is, do you want this to be the rest of your life? Do you just want to be some nerd who's hunched over on the keyboard and just jacking it to the most ridiculous things in the world? Or do you want to, get up to a higher level of consciousness or whatever? That's why I think thoughts are important. So I don't know. That's just my take.
I'm curious to hear Professor Jacobson's hot takes on this. Oh God. We went from like satanic pedophiles to VR.
Well, I guess what I've been thinking about as you all have been talking is the relationship between sex and power. And particularly when it comes to sexual violence, the way in which I understand it, and I was thinking about, can you recognize an outlet for a sexual desire that's about power to a machine, right? Or to something that, exactly. You would say doesn't have feelings. And I think that, that's where that probably fails. Jillian?
No, I mean, that's actually, it's interesting because that's exactly what I was thinking when Jules was talking about this as well. I was kind of thinking, if what it is that gets someone off in that case is the power element, if you know that you're doing it to something that isn't sentient, I don't necessarily know if it would hit the same way necessarily, right? So I don't know if that necessarily would make a difference at all.
Yeah,
I mean,
I don't know.
Talking specifically about power.
So you're saying that the rape robot pussy hit different?
What?
The rape robot pussy hit different?
I didn't hear the first part.
The rape robot
pussy hit different.
I just think like if your kink is like a power kink, I don't think a robot would necessarily do it for you, right? I mean, if the idea is you want it to be a sentient being that you are taking advantage of.
Well, yeah, look, people have kinks where they want to dress up like a horse and put a fucking horsetail in their ass and crawl around. And like, it's not the real thing, but it still gets them off.
Shout out to Mr. Hands.
Oh
Shout out
God,
to Mr. Hands. Yeah,
No,
but
but
I think there's a differentiation there too, right? Like I think if you're a person that genuinely wants to have sex with a horse, I don't necessarily know if like a guy with a horse tail is going to do it for you. You know what I mean?
No, but
So
this
I think
is
it's
like,
the same
but
thing
again,
with
this
rape.
is a pretty old question in literature. Like this is even like Philip K. Dick stuff, where he's writing about like what was the book that inspired Blade Runner? Dream of Electric Sheep.
Yeah,
Do androids dream?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
Like it seems that the mechanization of life, it sort of like any sort of gothic literature, if you could consider sci-fi gothic or xenogothic. Shout out to xenogothic on Twitter. It seems that there always has to be with the outside, which defines gothic literature. It seems sci-fi is similar in terms of there being a pervasive eroticism, and we've covered this in other streams, but it seems that it always goes back to the Oedipal, to the erotic, in terms of where literature goes in its most speculative gothic forms, whether it's beasts or whether it's vampires or whether it's robots. It seems like this is a very ancient question. Like the first robot novel, if I recall correctly, was written in like the 18th century or something like that. And again, it had a sexual component to it. So it seems
New
that,
Atlantis by Sir Francis Bacon.
Yeah, there you go. Even older, right? But it seems that eroticism, it always tends to be an ever-present origin in terms of human experience, and we have to express ourselves now in terms of a current reality. It's sort of like what Jung said about the flying saucer thing, where it's like a contemporary metaphor for the contents and the collective psyche of humanity, right? It seems that now, if it's not being taken sexually by vampires, now it's being taken sexually by robots. If I recall correctly, there was even a recent short story about that, where like the robot becomes the robot can simulate a family or so forth. Fiction becomes reality, and reality becomes fiction. And as cliche as that sounds,
well, that's
right?
the idea behind this really awesome book, Patrick Harpur's Daimonic Reality, which traced all the different stories people told about seeing fairies and demons and UFOs, and how a lot of these things are kind of like reflections of our subconscious coming back to certain people, either in a psychedelic inebriated state or just somebody driving down the road and seeing some little green men, where certain things may be high technology and other things could be intruding upon our waking life world, or our dream world intruding upon our waking life world. And this is the question that's always fascinated me: where is the bridge between these two worlds? Because this one feels really solid, but that's just because we're so used to this consensus that we've made of what this reality is about. But we have Verse Laloon here. Verse, great of you to join us.
Hello, what's up?
Hey, so I don't know how much you've heard about us talking about sexuality right now, but I want to get your take going back to literature. That was the original subject, and you were a teacher in different schools. You were a teacher in a charter school, public school, and I know you didn't teach literature, but you were around teachers who did, and you saw the environment. So yes. I'm curious about what your take is on the state of contemporary literature.
I would say, as I don't know exactly what's been said because I kind of just came to the stream, but I would say that in general the trend is towards shorter books and also audiobooks. There was like pretty much a mandate that all students had to like listen to audiobooks so long while they read to like improve fluency. Most kids ended up just listening to the audiobook and not reading the book as well.
Sounds right.
And like listen to it on like 1.5 speed. As you would imagine, everyone's kind of attention span is shortening. So the trend, especially since people are relying less and less on traditional publishers, the trend is to lower page counts. Because you don't need the whole point of having a large page count previously was so that you can print the name and stuff on the side of the spine, which you don't really need any longer. So there's no real reason to pad the page count.
it kind of harkens back to what we were talking about with Logo before, where we talked about Vladimir Nabokov's Ada, or Ada, I don't know how to pronounce it, and how difficult of a wall it is to climb in the very beginning of that book to actually get to a lot of the good stuff and to appreciate it and to be much, just to raise your consciousness, to use that term again, as far as the kind of material that you're reading. And it seems like the examples you're bringing up does the opposite, where it's trying to cater to a much more childlike way of reading. It's like creating a kid's Happy Meal,
It's a very fun read as you're going through it, but it's time intensive and there's a lot of plot lines. Like, there's nothing intrinsically hard about it, but it just requires a lot of, keeping a lot of stuff in your memory. You got to flip through all the footnotes. It's just not something that's you could do easily with modern distraction, which is the whole point of the book anyway. But
Lev,
yeah.
I think you forgot to ask Delicious Tacos and Now Verse what their favorite novels are.
Yes.
I'm curious.
Actually, my favorite novel is East of Eden.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
That or Infinite Jest, but that's like my hipster answer, so I don't ever say it
Infinite
first.
Jest. Did you read the footnotes?
I read all of it.
The lit
And I wrote
answer.
all over it. Yeah, I read every word of it.
I couldn't get through it. I gave up after 300 pages or something. I'll go back to it maybe.
Maybe.
I'm pro Infinite Jest. I think it's a very good book. I think I'm part of the backlash to the backlash, and I think it's stylistically interesting. I don't understand what the fuck he's trying to say. Maybe I'll reread it again in sobriety since it's about Alcoholics Anonymous apparently. But,
yeah, I read it when I stopped drinking for several years, so it was very topical for me.
Isn't it kind of similar to Birdman, the virtue of ignorance, the unexpected virtue of ignorance? I like kind of put them to. I group them together for some reason. That whole, because there's those scenes in Birdman when they're talking about meaning and significance and things that matter. And like I thought Infinite Jest is part of the corrosive nihilism school of there is no truth, there is no meaning, science has nothing to say about human values. Like this is all a big joke and then we die.
No, it's more sincere than that. It's rebelling against that. It's more sincere. It's like new sincerity type stuff. It's not really nihilistic in that way.
That's the thing though. The question is like, can the book be understood outside of Alcoholics Anonymous? Because I'm in AA, right? But I wasn't when I read Infinite Jest, and that's a huge amount of what the book is about. And like knowing, but going through 6 years of AA, I remember shit that was talked about in Infinite Jest. So, and AA is certainly is a religion, sort of, and it's certainly not a nihilistic one. So I'd be interested.
Didn't he? But he killed himself.
The other thing about
but he had a lot of clinical depression.
Whatever his philosophy was, don't adopt it. Obviously it doesn't work out too good. But
people say I look a lot like him, by the way. I don't know if I do.
Oh yeah, I see it. You just need the bandana.
You should go around telling people that he's back. My books are so good that I came back from the grave.
It's like Alex Jones became Bill Hicks.
Or Bill Hicks became Alex Jones.
No, but DT, what's your favorite novels, by the way?
I was going to say.
I think Last Temptation of Christ by Nikos Kazantzakis, by Michelle Houellebecq. I got to put Women by Charles Bukowski in there. And then what else? Like, what do you consider a novel, right? I loved reading the Aeneid when I was in Latin class. Is that a novel? It's got to be, right? I love Notes from Underground. What the fuck else? I think that's plenty. But Last Temptation of Christ deserves a reread, and I haven't read it in 20 years, so I'll need to pick that up again.
I really enjoyed the movie. I don't know if would you compare the movie to the book? Are they?
I mean, the book is much better. The movie is fascinating because, first of all, fucking weird ass Willem Dafoe. I'm a scientist myself. Willem Dafoe as Jesus Christ is. Who among you has not sinned? What a weirdo! And then like Harvey Keitel,
great cast.
It's like, oh Jesus, what's the matter with you? It just doesn't like. It's just Martin Scorsese like he gets a lot of the theological parts of it maybe, but he's just like, he doesn't get like, if you have people in ancient times, I'm sorry, like they have to speak with British accents. You cannot
Yeah.
have fucking Brooklyn ass Harvey Keitel. It just doesn't work. Defoe is great as always, but it's distracting in this day and age because he's like fucking blonde-haired, blue-eyed, Iowa fucking farm boy looking, and so you don't really buy him as Jesus.
That just reminds me of that scene in The Sopranos with Ralph Cifaretto, where he's like, they didn't have flat tops in ancient Rome.
Oh yeah, his gladiator obsession.
Yeah.
Ralph Cifaretto's gladiator obsession.
You know what's funny is that I admire Defoe's like ability to like just take like totally weird out there roles, like his role in Existence or his role in Antichrist. I think that's crazy. But it's funny you mentioned Martin Scorsese, because I was going to mention that about contemporary art and contemporary literature. That's that when it comes to art and literature within the last few decades, it's like nothing interests him because nothing compelling happens. It's just about the integers of selling people stuff. But it's crazy. You would consider him like one of the top American directors in terms of what becomes popular. I mean, I grew up like stereotypical Italian watching like the Goodfellas and Casino, right? So yeah, it's really, but even he sees it, right? And I don't know. I mean, The Irishman, you could say, was here and there, hit or miss. But
Well,
I thought he was overshooting a target when he was saying it's not real cinema. It's like there's something frustrating. He just, that's outside his scope of articulatable ability. And so he just goes to heck with it all. Like, that's just not real cinema. And then people have to kind of like decipher what he means, like why he has such a bone to pick with that stuff.
Well, in the fucking 50s, there were, 90% of the movies were about giant radioactive ants, right? Or, or radioactive something attacking American small towns. There's always been schlock, and the dominant culture has always been schlock. And Scorsese was briefly spoiled because, from about 1970 to up until Jaws, somehow some accident happened where good artistic movies were being made, and that was the norm, right? So Godfather and whoever like Bob Rafelson movies and all this other, all this whatever, I forget what that group was called. To my knowledge, that was the only time in history that ever happened in the movies. It's always been, maybe in the 40s you had like detective movies and big dramas and stuff, but there was also like Esther Williams musicals and other shit. I'm not saying that that's garbage, but it's certainly not. It's fucking dopey. You got to admit, it's fucking dopey.
But how much of that stuff though had a lot of these social justice political undertones as opposed to today? Because
they all do. Well, not like the same stuff.
They all supported the dominant whatever the dominant morality was, I'm sure.
Well, back then, so many people were Stalinists, so we're talking about like the 1940s. That was the thing to be. But as far as the kind of movie, Hollywood was pretty, at least during the 40s, you had what's his name? Not Goldwyn, but the other guy, Louis B. Mayer. So you had Louis B. Mayer doing movies that would resonate a lot more with families, like Wizard of Oz. So,
well, I don't think Louis B. Mayer was a Stalinist.
No, well, that's my point. Like, people who were in Hollywood were churning out stuff that was not part of what the intelligentsia was obsessed about at the time. But now it seems... but the
different. Golden age of cinema was when us based Catholics ran Hollywood. Then they got rid of the Catholic code, and then what all went downhill from there.
Is that kind of what that movie was about, the last Coen Brothers movie, Hail Caesar? Because they had a Catholic guy who was kind of like calling the shots.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
It was the antitrust laws that created this monopoly in Hollywood that the people that make the movies can't be distributors of their movies. And Netflix and the internet has appended this. But I mean, that's the problem, right? As in, you can make a great movie, and if no one picks it up for distribution, no one will even see it. And then it creates a scenario when people won't even fund your movie if they think you'll at all, because it's physically illegal for production companies to also own the distribution chains. It's like if you're Disney, it's illegal for you to own AMC theaters. It's a bad law. It's a bad
It's legal
law
for them
because
to
it
own
actually creates
ABC.
these artificial monopolies, these more of this corporatism.
Tacos?
Yeah, Disney owns ABC though, and they own Disney Plus, right? I mean, you know,
They get
right,
around
but
it.
they can't own the movie theaters. They can't own AMC. They can't
Right.
own Lowe's, right?
Yeah, but they're slowly becoming irrelevant, don't you think? Like
No, they
in the
just
midst
partner
of-
with it though. Don't they like partner with it?
Yeah, they do partnerships, I think, but it affects the supply chain. It affects the whole back end model. And so now that you have people distributing through the internet, it's also hurting these production companies and these movie theaters because it's harder for them to compete, right? Because they have these artificial obstacles and hoops to go through, right? It's very similar to how we regulated railroads because they were unfair to the railroads. And then we
But then-
unregulated
then-
airplanes because it was unfair to the trucks and the railroads. And now we're all have more expensive products and shipping because you can't get rid of the legislation. You have all this bureaucratic glut that just compounds and compounds and compounds and compounds, right?
So, but nobody's
You have to take it
stopping
to the
them from
Supreme
making
Court
a
to take
streaming
it away.
service like Netflix. Netflix. The good news is, you know, first of all, I mean, if you are giving the libertarian argument for deregulating Disney for some reason, they are competing with Netflix. They started Disney Plus. I think they own a huge chunk of Hulu, so they're directly competing with Netflix, and nothing's stopping them. And I think even if Disney was able to legally own a theater chain, that would mean nothing in terms of the threat. That is a different question. Although I agree with you, sure, why the fuck not? I mean, they, you know, who cares if they own a theater chain or not? However, you know, they can just start. There's a literally like, you know, the classic meme libertarian argument is just make your own Netflix, but they can just make their own Netflix, and they do. And the end result is going to be that there's 15,000 different Netflixes, and you know, you're going to be paying more than you were for cable.
Yep.
Previously.
How would you, Tacos, talk about like the spirit of the time today as far as the idea of the bugman, the idea of someone just living on artificial things completely disconnected from the world?
I don't believe the bugman is real. I don't think any man is a bugman in his soul. I think people have to play the bugman. Of course, I will be, as you know, right before this live stream, I was playing the bugman on a conference call, and then right after, I'm going to jump on another conference call and play the bugman again. But no man is a bugman in his soul. No man really, you know, thinks about branded entertainment and you know, being a better New York Times, you know, social justice person or any of these things in their soul. What he thinks about is, you know,
so it's like
fucking pussy.
That's such a hot take right there.
Yeah.
It's like a naked emperor situation, right? Like when people just don't want to admit the obvious. But that's what we were talking about before. Like how many people today are just threatened by the idea that they might be perceived as a misogynist if they just say like one wrong thing. Like
it's more about how you recover afterwards. See, the people that are afraid of being seen as a misogynist, like, are actually really afraid in their ability to smooth things over if they're interpreted the wrong way too. Because like anyone that's afraid of being perceived as a misogynist isn't a misogynist, right? Like I would assume so, but then something else is stunting their confidence.
Tacos?
That's an interesting point. Yeah. So that's an interesting point that I'm still trying to process, right? Anybody afraid of being accused of being a misogynist isn't a misogynist. Look, I'm anonymous for a reason. It's because because I still do have to have a job, right? But so, and the reason that I'm anonymous is construed to be really, you know, wicked in those ways. But it's true that I'm not really a misogynist. Jesus Christ. Yeah, maybe that's a really good point. However, it is, you know, people's livelihoods are so precarious and fragile, and especially if you're in the corporate world, like it is easy to get somebody fired. Like this woman, who got fired over the weekend for screaming at the guy in the bird watching area in Central Park. Like just you have to assume, right? She was the head of insurance investment at Franklin Templeton. I don't know how big Franklin Templeton is, but I've heard of it. Therefore, they have a lot of money. Therefore, like presumably she was pretty good at investing in whatever the fuck the head of insurance investment does there. Like she was making people money. But it's so easy to just dismiss her and make her unemployable. And look, she did seem completely insane. She was obviously choking that fucking stupid cocker spaniel to death. Like I don't know how real cancel culture actually is. I don't know how many people's eyes of it is compared to people that are actually out there being pigs and sexually harassing people and making people's lives miserable. But the fear of it is certainly very pervasive. And every time I want to argue that it's really not a big deal, I'm staring at this Zoom screen right now where my name, Delicious Tacos, is displayed, not my face and not the name that's on my birth certificate. And the reason for that is because, I gotta pay the rent, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it shouldn't be like that. Should it be like that? I don't know. Like,
depends on your social circle.
I'm just realizing I made a huge mistake using my real name.
Yeah, well, that's what I'd like. If any young people are listening to this, don't use your real name. Stay anonymous, right? You can only pop your cherry once. So
facts.
Stay fucking anonymous as you can, as long as you can. There's no reason.
I don't think so. I think.
Yeah, but what you do, like nobody
long-term strategy.
Nobody is going to come after you for being a libertarian, right? Whereas a lot of people do come after me for being a date rape advocate.
A what?
What? Yeah, no.
Perception that he's like some kind of
For being
I don't believe it. I don't believe it.
Fringe character, let's say.
You just said you weren't a misogynist a second ago.
No, but irony is clearly hard for people to.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's why. Well, we were talking earlier before the stream started. All the authors of the Federalist Papers wrote in pseudonyms.
Right.
Right. So there's a long tradition of writing in pseudonyms. No question about it. And I think it has its own merit, and it doesn't ever need to be justified simply because this is not something that happened yesterday.
Well, here's the thing. I'm curious to see what Professor Jacobson thinks of this, because I think a lot of it does depend on set and setting. Like, I went to a pretty, not like a really big university. In Canada, it really doesn't matter in terms of because our universities are pretty federalized, right? But I went to a decent sized university, and everyone knew about what I believed in and who I was online, to the point where professors looked up my articles, and I never had that big of a problem because I went to a pretty decent university in terms of discourse and speech. But I'm curious to know what the landscape is, because I do have a lot of professors I know that say that a lot of these claims tend to be overblown. But then there are other horror stories that you hear where, cancel culture is definitely real, and the selectivity in terms of who they allow to reach in terms of positions of power, that is a big issue. So I'm curious, as someone within academia, what you think about all of this.
Mm-hmm. I haven't seen it in my classroom. I think and it could be, being I'm at a regional state, so it's a public institution in the southern part of New Jersey, between New York and Philadelphia. Most of the students are in-state students within, an hour or so of our campus. And so it could be, these are students that are used to being around, a particular community and have negotiated some of those discourses. So it's not that everyone agrees, has the same political or ideas about culture, but that maybe in some ways, because it's regional in that way, maybe I'm seeing in some ways some less strident conflict. Thinking more broadly, I think that there has been, I've seen examples of scholars being called out because of expressing particular views. In some cases, it's resulted in faculty not being hired. Maybe if they've been, maybe one of the more well-known cases is Stephen Salita. I'm trying to think of, there was an NYU professor, female professor, I think.
Ronan?
Yes.
Ronald.
Yeah. And that had to do with a graduate student accusing her of sexual harassment, I believe. And so, the academia is no different than the corporate world, than Hollywood in that sense, in the ways in which, people from, oh, look at the kitty cat. Sorry. So those are some examples, in terms of the way I haven't seen it again, like directly at my institution, but in academia, those are two cases that I've read about in the media, and maybe have gone beyond sort of academic newspapers.
Yeah, because, well, that's the thing. That's the perception that a lot of literature department, a lot of lit departments and things like that, they tend to be the center of the quote unquote SJW stuff. But I think, yeah, it is a case by case basis. But definitely there is the argument to be made that I don't know, but see, I don't know, the art world is kind of a bit of a degree worse in terms of that type of stuff. But then again, these institutions with self-publishing, things like that, they're becoming progressively more open or even weakened in some regards. I mean, one in our spheres, there's I don't know if you've heard of him. His name's Justin Murphy, and he was a professor, and he basically left academia to pursue a career in being an internet personality with interviews and things. So maybe you could look up his story. He said some pretty controversial stuff, but he's a lefty, and he left academia and political science. So he did that for other reasons and so forth. So yeah, that's
He's like a John Mao lefty. John Mao. He did the music.
Oh, John Mao.
He did the music for The Feeling When No Girlfriend, and he wrote his, what was it? The piece he wrote to get a PhD is called Communication and Control. He describes himself as left of left of left of left.
Oh, you mean John Mouse? Musician, right? Yeah. I didn't know he had a district. Huh. Interesting.
I don't know what left of left.
Most of these cases, I would say there was some sort of process involved. Whereas I think some of the cases that, we don't know, when it's a private corporation who's firing an individual, there's usually non-disclosures. And so we may never know exactly the terms of her termination. But certainly, did not help, obviously contributed to why she was fired.
I didn't have anything to say. I just was making a sound.
I heard, the thing is, I listened to the Red Scare break this thing down recently, and they basically said everyone involved was a Karen. But they basically said how it started was, so she had her dog off a leash, and then he pulled out dog treats. So even though she sucked and her reaction sucked and the way she held her dog sucked, and then she's pulling out her phone, and when she's saying that, oh, I'm gonna call the police and say an African American is threatening me, fuck you, you're done. But I do understand being worried when someone without a dog suddenly pulls out dog treats and is beckoning your dog to come over to him.
Why is that? That's why you get a dog.
I know, but I could see someone thinking this. Well, what the Red Scare girls said is they would think someone was trying to kill their dog. That's what they said. I don't own a dog.
That's really strange. Literally everyone likes dogs, or for the most part, unless you were like traumatized.
My dad hates dogs, bro.
Unless he was traumatized from like getting bit or something. Or, like,
he is traumatized from getting bit. He is traumatized from getting bit. That's funny. Donald Trump doesn't have a dog.
You don't have to have. I don't have a dog. I live in New York City.
But every president has.
I love dogs. I like dogs.
But also, if you're like a well-dressed person who's identifiable, you know, if you give a poisonous treat, they could trace that shit back to you. So I don't really see how that works.
You can't kill dogs. Like I'm pretty sure that's just
that would not go over well.
I mean, that's what Michael Vick. He went to prison for. I guess I wasn't sure if it's for the animal cruelty, right? For like 5 years.
Yeah, dog fights.
You can't do that.
Back during that time on the internet, people were making memes with him being a Pokemon trainer.
Oh God, yeah, I remember that.
That's really good.
Those are simpler, more chaotic times.
Well, see, we kind of miss those times because now, since there is all this cancel culture, and I really like how Tim Dillon phrased it, where he talked about how awesome the 90s were because people were, you know, nihilistic about politics. You know, not everybody had to have a fucking opinion about everything.
You know what's funny? You know what's funny about that is to mention Sam Chris again, who himself being canceled over spurious things, and he's like, you know, dirtbag left, like Chapo Trap House affiliate, right? He wrote this great article on his blog about, if you look it up, he talks about how the war in the 90s was between the David Foster Wallace, like new sincerity stuff, and the total irony, nihilism, cynical Bert Easton Ellis genre. And he said that David Foster Wallace won with sincerity, and it's terrible that we need to go back to cynicism and irony because sincerity nowadays has become permeated with like current year politics, and like that's the only sincerity that we're left with. Like it's a really good article.
That's not sincerity though. I feel like that's
it's hijacked.
The modern politics.
That's what Delicious Tacos was saying, that it's not sincere, but
it's like the furthest thing from.
I think Bert Easton Ellis is sincere. I just think his fiction is, you can't compare the fiction and the work with the man. Like so David Foster Wallace and Bret Easton Ellis, both from what I'm familiar with, are both sincere, but they both have just different tropes and motifs and themes and everything in there. No,
the actual writing is what's sincere versus like I don't participate in that whole art. You can't separate the artist from art thing. I actively believe you always should, unless otherwise stated. And so I don't even consider the artist almost like ever practically, unless it's like amplifies what they're trying to say. So
they're listening to Bursum.
Yeah, exactly. I love Bursum. Like I'm black. I listen to Bursum. Like I listen to black metal in general. You know, I listen to rap music like TK. Like he's in prison right now for life. Like it's
Snitch 9.
I love with 6ix9ine, but anyway, they're all it is silly to, at no point in history you can, for almost all artists, they're all kind of fringe people. They're all kind of schizotypal. So like they all have really unsettling lives, and that's what allows them to create these like paradigm transcending artworks. So it's naive and like frankly dumb that this is like modern discourse now regarding art. Like no.
Well, yeah, they want to do things like they took William Waterhouse paintings outside of the I think it was it the Met Gallery or something. I mean, there was other people like Balthus. I don't know if you know about this artist. He's another prolific realist artist in the contemporary times. But there's a bit more of a case to be made for taking, like, I don't agree with, by the way, taking paintings off the gallery walls, but there's a bit more of a case to be made with Balthus because he does like paint little girls very like erotically, like that's his thing, right? But yeah, this even is still,
like, I'm gonna make a real hot take, and then I'm probably gonna get in trouble for it. I still think that even if the actual artist, like the artist is judged on his action on their own merit, right? So if like you find out that the artist is a pedophile, then go put that person in prison, right? But if the art itself is separate, has some kind of seat in culture, I don't think that the art needs to be, or like, you know, policed, right?
Yeah, like didn't Burroughs kill his wife?
Yeah, if he kills him, that's murder. That's an action.
Yeah, there's a lot of. It's funny because like killing your wife seems to transcend the political spectrum with art, because Burroughs was kind of like hippies lefty, and then there was like, of course, there was like, I think that composer who was like a right wing lunatic that killed his wife, and then Carl Andre killed his girlfriend, who which is unfortunate because Anne Mendieta is one of my favorite artists. He had probably more likely killed her, and he's like a brutalist communist artist.
And then
So it is
Chris
crazy,
Benoit.
yeah.
Chris
What?
Benoit is in his
Chris
in his
Benoit?
wrestling.
There you go.
The like, even let's say like TK, right? Like his like he's a good example because he's like a 16-year-old who kind of like got caught up in the gangster rap hard image, and he killed like old people in Texas. Like he has one of the biggest hit songs. He kind of changed like what hip hop sound like, but he also is a confirmed murderer. His like his most famous music video was filmed on the run for murder charges, right? And he's in prison. He's never getting out. Now, with that said, his song, the sincerity of the lyrics in the song, and like, you know, the image and the person aligning created art that is literally changed the way hip hop sounded. Like all rap more or less adjusted to accommodate the new sound.
Really,
Now,
he had that big of an impact.
TK, yeah. When I taught middle school, I found, so my modern hip hop taste I found from teaching middle school and high school, and they all kind of were like, it had like swept through, like every kid was like listening to it on loop. I would come back to the classroom and they would be playing it on the screen. Like he just kind of was a cultural force.
So would you put him in the same sort of class as visionary hip hop artists like Rakim and Big L?
Yes.
And people like, wow, that's, maybe I should start listening to him.
Yeah, TK would be up there. I think all these like 6ix9ine people hate him for snitching, but all the rappers are snitchers. Sorry, and he's also visionary. Like but he has horrible life. Triple X Temptation has Tentacion or whatever. He has a horrible life. Like the art and artists are often going to be, you know, problematic, and that doesn't. And you are. It's childish to be like to go through history and like selectively cherry pick things out of history because, oh, I don't like that. Like personally, to push it even further, I don't even really think they should take down those statues in like the South.
I was just
like,
about to say that. Yeah, like
I went to Carolina, and in Carolina, there's the Confederacy statues on campus, and they like they want to pull them down, like Silent Sam or whatever, and they want to like try to retroactively change the history of the campus to accommodate a narrative that like I don't like. It's, while sure in history it's always been the victors rewriting the previous paradigm, so it is aligned with, you know, precedent. But with that said, you know, if you're really trying to be like, you know, forward thinking, you would go, oh, we always do this, maybe we should leave this alone, or like put it in a museum or something. Like don't just destroy it.
Yeah, there were things we were always doing.
Auction it. Right? Yeah, auction it and then build something else, right?
Well, they wanted to go after Picasso of all people, and he was, you know, the chic in nouveau riche communist artist back in the day. But I mean, a lot of his work can be seen as deeply reactionary in some ways, as Bronze Age Pervert points out. But like, for example, Egon Schiele, one of my favorite German expressionists, he got canceled. Well, he's been dead for 100 years almost. But he was, you know, recently had his artwork thrusted into controversy because he would pay prostitutes that he would sleep with, and he would draw them in pastel and watercolor. And Sheila really exposed a lot of the grittiness and ugliness. And I wrote an article on my blog. I have the series called Modern Art Madness.
Boy, isn't Mademoiselle the whatever Avignon like the painting that created modern art from Picasso?
Pretty much,
literally the same exact thing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So it's like, shut up. Like you lost your opinion. You're not allowed to speak anymore. Like when they're just dumb, I can't handle just
The Super Iron Bob says the irony of one of the statues pulled down in Atlanta was celebrating Confederates who toured the North, rebuilding bridges between the brother states.
Yeah, it's asinine. Truthfully, it just and that's kind of why I find myself entrenched in these anonymous artists, because I'm like, thanks, you're actually doing something real. I appreciate it.
Well, there is a kind of fear that I'm noticing in and how I'm observing everything as far as the past being slowly eroded and it being considered to be, just like some old white men, so we have to ignore them and focus on all the other groups. My biggest concern, I'm curious, Kristen, what you think about this, is having a naked emperor effect as far as, let's say there is a voice among people who are underrepresented that may not exactly lean politically the same, left-leaning direction that would be much more common, and they would not be heard, and instead you would have someone who may not even be that good or that talented, and you can't say anything. You cannot say this is, this is not a talented person, because then they'd accuse you of being racist or whatever, and I think that's a big problem. I'm curious what you think.
Mm-hmm. When we talk about these issues, like in classes with my students, and it particularly comes up, with educators, what are you going to teach? You're going to have the power to, construct your own canon. Or even if it's just, after you leave this classroom, you get to decide, where you spend your money, what you pick and why. And so, my educator response is that, I want, to cultivate independent thinkers that regardless of whatever my personal views may be, that I've provided them with the critical thinking tools to discover what they think and why. And so that's my educator response. In terms of how that aspect, I noticed in the chat someone mentioned, being in an MFA and feeling a bit like they were on eggshells about certain views that could be expressed. And so I think that that aspect of cancel culture, or like if a particular writer gets accused sexual harassment or something like that, right, then there's the push, you can assign that particular author. Or if, like you were talking about, various artists, right, that have checkered past, which is, you look at literary history, that's all over as well. What I've noticed trends in terms of, how my students think through this process, they tend to, it matters whether or not the artist is alive or not for many students, and whether or not they'll personally profit from what it is. If they felt they paid their dues to their society, right, is also another element that seems to, is important in informing their decisions. Mm-hmm. So those are elements that, that I would say inform my own thinking too. But it's hard. I think it's really hard to talk about in the abstract. That it's so to give a specific example. So Sherman Alexie has been one of those authors that's had a personal controversy surrounding him. I really enjoy his writing. I've heard him speak on a couple of occasions. He's an amazing speaker. I haven't taught his books since the controversy, but that's also, I always change up what I teach when I teach contemporary literature. And I want to make sure that now that he's much more of a, I would say, known commodity, that I'm introducing students to some different writers. So wasn't that was maybe the only factor, but it was, I can't say I didn't think about it when I was selecting what books, I was going to assign in a given semester.
But what if
I think if they're alive, that's pretty much, that can be kind of here or there.
But what if
like you could watch Varge Vickers on Bitch.
Yeah, I follow him. Like I personally don't. I'm also speaking from a position of elitism insofar as my parents are like, my dad is like was a professional artist. Like he was in a very notable modern dance company. When I was in college, they literally taught about the dance company my dad was in, and I was like, oh, okay, that's cool. So I was raised in a family that I had we didn't watch football. We had Culture Sunday, and we went to like museums and galleries and stuff like that. But anyway, so I've always been of the opinion that the conversation, the cultural significance is significantly more important than whether or not it upsets people. And I also find that art that tends to get too bogged down in current political sensibilities disappears. and you never hear from it again. It's those artists that decide to
Yeah.
make something work, like that's actually real, that stand the test of time. So
100% agree with that. Yeah.
So when I see like Hugo only put sci-fi novels that are like satisfying diversity boxes, I'm like, that stands against the spirit of like Hugo, for example. Like, while some of them are really good, like I don't know, I can't think of any off the top of my head now, but like it has to be good for on its own merit, not just because it's satisfying a political whatever quota. Yeah.
That's very
It's almost
interesting.
like the
Yeah.
curators, in some sense, are like the demarcation line between the curators and artists is blurring. Because when you think about Post Malone and Tekashi 6ix9ine, I remember when Lev and I first started talking about this stuff, his arguments for why these people have no talent would be, and I'm putting words in his mouth a little bit.
No. I wouldn't say they have no talent. What I
I don't
would
like Post
say,
Malone, but
they can't sing, right? They're
6ix9ine.
auto-tuned.
No,
They
no,
can't
no.
sing.
They're
not
They don't write their songs.
No, don't put words in my mouth. Here's
But
my take.
that's true.
Here's my take. My take on a lot of these artists is that, to me, their music seems to be more, let's say, like we were talking before about people being easily distracted, right? Like, it seems like that kind of music is a lot more sugary. It's a lot more candy-like than things that, to me at least, seem to take a little bit more time to digest. But that's just my take on it as an outsider looking at it. And
I would say yes for Post Malone because he's literally a pop artist. 6ix9ine, the reason why it sounds like that is because he literally forced everyone else to get on his bandwagon. Like when his song Gummo dropped, it sounded like nothing else. He's actually been making videos and songs for like a decade, and he's been like writing a song, directing and filming music videos for like a decade, and like no one cared about him until Gummo came out, and he literally changed what hip hop sounded like. So now it sounds like everything just sounds like a hip 6ix9ine ripoff now, and like people are like, oh, he has no talent. He just says like blah blah blah. But I'm like, he's put the work in. He crafted an image. He made a distinct sound. He's actually a good rapper, even though people don't like to admit it. Like his like lyricism is actually clever. It's just he just happens to have controversy surrounding him. And sometimes
Do you think does he write his lyrics?
Yes, he
or
definitely
does he have songwriters?
They all have like people who help them and like get writers credits, but like he writes his lyrics for the most part. Like he has a very there's no one who could write like now maybe because he's fairly large, but up until his notable first album, no one rapped like him, so you couldn't really get someone to write songs for him.
Well, let's put it this way: it's like very chaotic.
Yeah, it's very unique and a specific type of chaos in the way he writes.
But like a Death Grips type chaos, would you say, or that's totally...
No, because that's more like a punk elitism chaos. Because like Death Grips is like very deliberate in their sound.
Yeah, well, they were influenced by like Propaganda and like that sort of elite, like East Coast hip hop.
And the drummer, punk. I mean, Zach Hill is in Hella, which is like super elitist math rock band.
That's
like,
right. Yeah.
The MC, like they're all like, it's a very conscious chaos. It's like Dillinger Escape Plan for rap.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Whereas like Tekashi 6ix9ine is also chaotic, but it's more natural, organic chaos.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe this is a normie take, but I like Biggie and Tupac a lot.
Everyone does, but they're like that's like saying I like Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin if you're a metalhead. Like, yeah.
You know what's crazy is that certain art forms, it seems that there's less of an acceptability of having like not like directly touching that artwork. Like, for example, in music and in writing, in literature, it seems like ghostwriters are almost like frowned upon, right? But when it comes to like art, like being in visual art, it seems that like you can get away with like Jeffrey Koons having an art factory, or like Mockman in Canada, where I come from, like having like understudies that basically paint the majority of his stuff, right? And he like choreographs like the situations that he photographs and then paints. It seems like visual art's like the only time where like an artist can like never touch the piece but can think of it. But whereas like like
Rubens.
I mean, that's kind of like, or was it? I thought it was not Rembrandt. Is it
Rubens? I think it was
Rubens. Yeah.
With all those thick ladies that he was painting. I like that style though. It's not although Rococo to me it's a little bit too.
Love Rococo.
Yeah, it's a little bit.
Rococo is.
I love it.
I like that stuff.
It's my favorite.
I know. To me, I like
I love
It's
it.
like Art Nouveau, right? That's
Yeah,
Art Nouveau.
no, I don't like Art Nouveau. It's like that's like Deco. Oh no, that's Art Deco. I'm getting
Yeah,
it
Art
confused now.
Nouveau is
Art
Rococo.
Art
No.
Nouveau was
Yeah,
before
yeah.
Art Deco. It was a direct response. It was a naturalization of the symbolist painters. Yeah.
Mhm.
So
I like Art Nouveau, but I know Rococo to me it's a little bit too.
Oh, Rococo. Yeah, that's the
Yeah,
yeah,
The
that's the
yeah.
frilly,
oh
like
yeah.
best. Oh yeah, yeah,
distracted.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I like the browns in Rembrandt, just like those really dark brown
Yeah.
colors and very human-like faces. That's kind
Master of thick
yeah.
paint. Yeah.
But I also like a lot of surrealist stuff, like for example, Bruegel. I don't know how to pronounce his name. The guy who did the that painting of the Tower of Babel, two different ones, and he
Oh,
did
was it
one.
Bruegel? Peter
Yeah,
Bruegel?
Bruegel. He
Yeah.
also did the one with I think it was like hundreds of different proverbs that were all in one painting, and that really inspired me
Mm.
to create artwork with a lot of little details in it, just like a lot of different scenes going on, so you could just like stare at it and just look into and see all the different stories. And as far as rap goes, like I like NWA, like I said before, I like Biggie, Tupac. I like Eazy-E. I like that song Real Motherfucking Cheese.
Yeah.
I think the music video is very nice there. But at the same time, I noticed just like with gangsta culture and hip hop, there seems to be like a resurgence of Kali if we're talking Hinduism. There seems to be this resurgence of this very, chaotic energy that's taken everybody, and everybody just gets obsessed with it. And it reminds me of something Rudolf Steiner said about jazz. And jazz is like less so, but still it has this element of chaos within it. And he was saying that this is something that, let's say if we go back to Africa, according to Rudolf Steiner, the tribes who had all of these different beats that they danced to, it was their way of summoning a deity and having the deity dance through them, and it was a religious experience. And his concern was that when you have music like jazz, and I think he may be able to apply the same to hip-hop, if you don't have that religious element in it, things could go wrong.
That's a cool take. I will say that all Black art forms are based in improvisation to some extent, and that chaos is always there. So, like, it's very noticeable now with the current phase of hip hop, and that's mostly because there was a backlash in the 2000s because of the Biggie Tupac deaths. So there was like a really big push to like, make it into popular culture and like make it more sterile, even though that still existed in like the underground, but like battle rap became really popular.
But what's strange is that it doesn't sound sterile. Like it may be sterilized in a certain way, but listening to Tupac, you hear like those women in the background singing,
Oh yeah, no, not Tupac. The decade after Tupac. So like
okay.
Early 2000s to like up until like 2009, I guess, somewhere around there. It was very sterilized hip hop, and like it was literally like nothing good really came out. It was because they were trying to like it was a response to like all the rappers getting killed, like Biggie and Tupac getting killed. But now we're then like streaming services and the internet showed up, and then like starting with, funny enough, Soulja Boy, they created like the internet rap era, and kids, and since rap is very much about being current, kids literally don't like modern rappers did not listen to Biggie, Tupac. Like there's like I can name a dozen like super famous modern rappers, and they'll all say like, yeah, I know Biggie is famous, like Little Yachty or Little Uzi or Vince. All of them were like, I've heard of these people, but I've never listened to them actively. And it's because all these kids have kind of rejected the golden age, I guess. It's now come back to have a very distinct, chaotic sound again, which I like. I'm all about it.
Different artists for different circumstances, right? Like you're not going to listen to Mozart in the club, right? A lot of like club music is for dancing. It's and for just like getting into a different emotional flavor, right? And I think some people try to compare apples to oranges like too much. And I do think I saw something that compared heavy metal music and jazz to classical music in terms of
heavy metal is classical music,
right? Like just even what just happens to the
there's
brain.
Jazz elements in it as well, like certain bands or certain genres. Yeah, but it's funny how it seems that like with certain genres, it can be certain art forms, it can become kind of difficult to transmute that chaos into something that is expressive. Like literature is a very cerebral. It's has a certain tact to it, where experimentations like the Beat Poets, for example, they managed to sort of harbor that sense of decoupling and chaotic nature. Visual art, of course, action painting, but of course, there's always a risk of what's the term that the one Frieza article called it? There's a risk of running into zombie formalism, where we just sort of LARP these styles of the past. And it seems that a lot of painters and a lot of literary people, they're hearkening. You can hearken back to a previous form to be inspired to create a new synthesis, but it seems that there's this pervasive stagnation to a lot of this. I'm sorry, it's been a few hours and my brain's kind of
I'm actually going to piggyback off that, and this is to take it back to my other big passion of anime. There is, when photography came around, it became a new art form. It was like, there was a pushback, but it was kind of like the merger of art and technology. And then similarly with like video, animation was originally hand drawn, but now in modern days, it's pretty much been completely converted to digital. And you see a resurgence of like creative artistic expression in anime, for example, because of like the merger of digital and traditional forms of art, and like that's why like there's a reason why Spirited Away gets Oscars and Pixar movies get Oscars, because it gives a new space for new stories to be able to be told that are not able to be told otherwise without seeming like they're just rehashing.
To be fair, Spirited Away was fully hand drawn. It may have been digitally colored.
It was.
Well, there were 3D elements within the world, like how they composited the backgrounds, how they did that 3D scene with the flowers when Chihiro was running through them. So there were 3D elements, of course, but those 3D elements were still composed out of actual paintings, and that's why some anime to me. And this goes to my work as well, because I'm an animator, and I notice that there sometimes is a lack of that realness when it comes to digital painting, and it's very difficult to actually, I think, make it as close as possible to the real thing, because you have all those little organic elements within the brushstroke that no Photoshop would ever be able to, to duplicate fully.
Mm-hmm.
And
I'm halfway through Death Note. I just started Death Note recently.
Have you ever read it before? You never seen it before?
I've never seen it before.
Oh,
it's really good.
A+.
Yeah, Jules is doing Death Note. I watched Death Note already. I loved it, and we also did Lelouch of the Rebellion, Code Geass, and that was a lot of fun.
Kristen, very similar series.
Kristen, what's your favorite anime?
Bro.
Yeah, it's Geass.
Code Geass.
This is
You've been corrected enough, right? If someone corrected me like 8 times. You can be sure I'd start saying it right.
They said it geese in Japanese. I'm pretty
sure
they
did. But it's Geass, bro. It's Geass.
Okay, fine, Geass. Kristen, what's your favorite anime?
Genre that I haven't explored. I've had students give me recommendations. I'm taking notes here, so
One Piece,
thank you. Yeah.
One Piece, definitely. Well, the manga.
I gotta see that.
Go
watch
for the manga.
That one's more definitely traditional comic book. It's way better than the animation.
Yeah.
But I'm so good because the graphic novel, right? I guess that's something we really haven't talked a lot about. But definitely that's something that we, if we're talking about contemporary trends, and that it's huge. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's also like that's what I wanted to be as when I was younger. Was like graphic novel animator, like Sandman, or I don't know what other stuff I have around here. Like were like pivotal, very like shifts for me and what I thought was like possible. Like I've always been a reader, but there was definitely like a 10-year span where I only read comic books, or in graphic novels and the such. But yeah, I there's a lot. There are different interesting stories that can be told when you can blend text and literature in like visual elements.
Yeah.
Well, my
dream... the one.
No, go on.
I just have read Fun Home. That's the one, I guess, graphic novel that I've read and taught. Yeah.
My dream is to get Neil Gaiman on this live stream, and no, I think that's actually going to
It's
happen.
very possible.
Yeah, because my friend Kimberly Butler, she is a good friend of Mr. Gaiman's, and she told me that we would definitely get along really well. So, and Kim is going to be on this Sunday, by the way. Open invite for everybody. This Sunday, we're having a Get It Off Your Chest live stream starting from 6 o'clock. So if you have
Like a
anything that's
Festivus.
been, exactly, the airing of grievances, if you have anything that's been bothering you throughout the week, that's going to be the stream for that. And by the way, while I'm talking about the stream-related stuff, please subscribe. The 15 people who are watching, maybe all of you have already subscribed. I don't know. If not, subscribe right now. We are a growing channel. We are the best, most underrated YouTube channel of all time. Look at the kind of community we were able to bring together here today. You know, we had a gender studies professor talking with delicious tacos.
Oh
and,
my
you know,
god.
like, it's amazing. I love it. And Kristen,
Yeah,
thank
do
you so
events.
much for being here. And well, I think this would bring us kind of like to the end of the discussion. I'm curious.
Hopefully there's no professional consequences as a result of this stream. Being with esoteric Twitter fascists.
What?
I
Are
really
you a
appreciate,
fascist? Are you a fascist? You're not a fascist. I don't know what this stuff is anymore. What the
Listen,
heck?
I'm not a fascist. I'm a super fascist. Okay, that's a quote to a. Never mind.
So I would love to hear everybody's just final thoughts on the evening. What did you guys think? Did you guys learn anything new? Let's start with Kristen.
I just want to thank you all for inviting me to be a part of your community here, and authors, and introducing me to new communities, new ideas, and for listening to what I had to say. So hopefully you found my contributions valuable. So thanks so much.
It was a great pleasure. Gio.
Oh, it was great experience. No, it was yeah, I think it's really crazy how you can take people who are within sort of a mainstream framework and expose them to Twitter weirdos and esoteric people, and it's really it's almost like a white pill, you know, again, the pill analogies, right? It's almost a white pill for me that you can have a platform where different people can come together and express themselves in such a way that there is no there's a sort of a paresia to it, a truth telling that I think is very interesting, that's sorely lacking. And who knows if things take off and, you know, we get the numbers right, but it's yeah, it's very interesting. I'm sorry, I haven't I can't think right now.
Gio,
So.
you've been here since the very beginning. You are the key to this whole.
Oh, I don't know
thing
about that.
No, don't do it.
What's a white pill? What's a
cornerstone.
white pill again? What's a white pill again?
White
The
pills like
opposite.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's hope and you know, it gives you like positive feelings.
It's the opposite of the black pill.
That's exactly what I want to do from the very beginning with this thing, because it is a very rare thing. Like, you guys gotta admit, these circles are usually very closed off from each other, but here we are achieving the impossible, and I'm very grateful for everyone to be here. And Verse, okay, first Jules, then Verse. So Jules, any final words, and then Verse will end the evening for us. Yeah, Jules.
Hey, I'm here all the time. I love doing this stuff. I wouldn't be doing it any other way. I wouldn't want to do it any other way. So, you know, I don't think anyone brings it like we do, and we're gonna keep it coming as long as we can. So
support us,
subscribe,
give us
become a
money.
patron,
Patreon.com.
buy shirts. We're gonna start doing
Also,
events.
check
We're
out-
figuring this out, man. We are figuring this out. Okay, you can't keep us down forever. We're coming. So
Check out Versus
we
podcast as well, friend
Oh,
of the
thanks.
show.
Facts. My opinion, to leave you with, I, you know, without any shred of irony, think that all culture is downstream from frog Twitter. And I also think that,
Yep.
and it's funny because actually the only books I've read this year have been books from people who have shown up today, like DT and Zero and Logo. That's all I've been reading because I've been interviewing them. And I genuinely think that they are pivotal cultural forces, and history will remember some of the things they've done. So
Sweet.
Beast.
And
I
with
hope to add to that pantheon with my own book one day.
For sure. I'll read all of them.
Wait, and where could
I have
everybody
to read.
find
I
you?
have to read. I only read Logo's book. I have to catch up.
Hold on,
I love Zero's book.
It's amazing.
Actually, it's
I have
so,
to read,
good.
HP,
God-shaped
yeah.
hole is great. By the way, where could everybody find you? So,
Me-
Kristen.
They can find me on Twitter at Dr. KJ.
Excellent. And Jules, where can people find you?
Bro, I'm half of the show.
Okay,
I'm,
fine.
let's-
Fine.
Don't ask me.
Jules P. Hamilton. That's Jules' Twitter handle. Geo?
Giant Geo, twitter.com. There you'll find links to my blog, my Instagram. I always post articles that I write, whether it's for the American Sun or Autistic Mercury or wherever. Rocca Reviews, that's where all of my art criticism stuff is going. My friend Seneca reads. Read that. It'll be my pinned tweet, my recent stuff. And yeah, that's pretty much, I'm done the shilling. So
Excellent. And Verse?
forthcoming, hopefully when I reach 5,000 follows, forthcoming Patreon, maybe forthcoming website. My buddy's a website designer, so who knows, maybe going.
I can't wait. We're going to do a website too. Definitely. Verse?
On Twitter at verse_laloon. The L is capitalized. I don't know if that matters though. On YouTube, I have, and Spotify, Apple, wherever podcasts are, I have the version 4 podcast. Version_4. Yeah, and I have a book, but I don't really show it because I don't like it anymore. So I'll come out when I come up with my second book. Then we can.
That's when we're going to do the other literary podcast, and I hope to have everyone on again. And I'm also going to bring a writer for the New Yorker on. That's going to be really cool. So
Oh, man.
it's happening. All right, everybody.